She didn't scream. She didn't break dishes. She didn't even cry. That's what nobody tells you about the moment you discover the person you built an empire beside. The one whose heartbeat you can feel through a bond older than any crown, chose someone else in the dark. Queen Seris didn't fall apart. She got quiet. The most dangerous kind of quiet. The kind that moves like smoke through a cracked door. The kind that removes a vow sigil from her throat, sets it dead center on a table, and walks out into a winter that has nothing on the coldness already living inside her chest. Stay until the end. Drop your city below. This one's for every soul who ever walked away with their spine still straight. The torches in the black marble corridor had been burning since midwinter, fed on rendered fat and pine resin, and they gave everything they touched a sickly amber color that Seris had never once found beautiful. Not in 6 years of walking these halls. Not on the night Vialor had led her through them for the first time, his hand at the small of her back, his voice low and deliberate as he named each banner hanging from the vaulted ceiling. The obsidian wolves, the crimson iron, the sigil of every clan that had bent the knee. She had listened carefully. She always listened carefully. That was how she had survived every room she had ever entered without being born into its furniture. She was returning from the Eastern Infirmary ward. A soldier named Breck had come in that afternoon with a shattered radius and a badly set field splint, and she had spent 4 hours undoing damage before she could do any good. Her fingers still ached. There was dried blood on her left cuff that the laundering staff would remove without comment in the morning, because the laundering staff had long since learned that when the queen returned from the infirmary, she returned looking like she'd been in a fight, and nobody asked a queen about her fights. It was past the second midnight bell. The palace corridor stretched ahead of her, polished and cold and utterly silent except for the torches and the distant groan of wind off the mountain. She almost walked past the war chamber door. She had done it 100 times. It was not her room. It was his. The maps, the troop rotations, the intelligence scrolls from the eastern frontier. She had her own study 2 floors above, where she kept the healer's ledgers and the economic correspondence, the 2 territories where her authority was absolute and unquestioned, and she had earned that authority with her own mind, not his name. They divided the empire that way, cleanly, deliberately. His war, her people. The overlap was governance. The overlap was effective. She almost walked past. Then she heard it. Not words. Words she could have categorized. Words she had a framework for handling because she was Seris, and she had a framework for handling everything that came at her in this palace with its knives dressed as smiles. It was not words. It was a laugh, soft, low, unmistakably intimate, unmistakably hers, meaning not Seris's. Meaning the laugh belonged to a mouth that had no sanctioned reason to be behind that door at the second midnight bell. Then the quiet that followed. That particular charged quiet that has a texture to it, that presses against the air in a way open conversation never does. Seris stopped walking. Her hand did not move toward the door. Her face did not change. Later, if anyone had been watching her in that corridor, which no one was, because she had ensured it, because she had over years developed a precise instinct for which corridors were watched and which were not. They would have seen a woman standing motionless beside a black marble wall with one hand pressed flat against the stone and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the middle distance that had nothing to do with geography. The bond hit her 6 seconds later. That is the thing about the alpha tether that the court poets always butcher when they write about it. They describe it as warmth, as connection, as a golden thread. They are writing from the outside. From the inside, when it recoils against betrayal, it does not feel like anything being broken. It feels like something screaming, like a wound opening in the chest cavity that has no blood and no visible mark, and cannot be shown to any physician, including herself, and cannot be treated with any herb or suture in her considerable knowledge because it is not the body. It is something older than the body. It is the part of the self that agreed once to be known completely by another person. It screamed. She pressed her palm harder against the stone. Breathed. Once. Twice. Her exhale fogged slightly in the cold corridor air. She thought, with the peculiar clinical precision that arrived in her worst moments like a visiting physician from a country she'd never been to. So that is what this is. Not a question. A diagnosis. She stood there perhaps another 30 seconds, Long enough for certainty to finish its work, long enough for the initial shock, and she would grant herself that one word, shock. She had not seen this coming with the part of herself that loved him, only the part that watched courts, to metabolize into something colder and more functional. Then she walked to their chambers. The moonlight came through the high windows and silver sheets across the floor. The royal bed was made with precise linen corners. 2 candles burned on the writing table. Their chambers had the particular quality of rooms that contain expensive objects arranged without warmth, because warmth is something people bring to rooms, and Valor Ashrin was many things, but he had never been a man who decorated with warmth. She had added 2 things over the years: a small pressed flower frame near the window that came from the frontier province where she was born, and a worn healer's satchel hanging on the left bedpost that she refused to replace because it had been with her before any of this had. She crossed to the mirror. The vow sigil rested against her sternum. Obsidian set in silver wire, etched with the old bonding script. She had worn it since the ceremony. She had not thought about removing it in the way one does not think about removing a hand. It had been part of the architecture of herself for so long that she only noticed it on the occasions when someone else commented on it. Usually, foreign dignitaries who recognized the tradition and looked at her with that particular expression of respect that she had decided was the most legitimate form of recognition this court had ever offered her. She reached back, unclasped it, held it in her palm for exactly as long as it took to walk from the mirror to the writing table. Set it down. Center of the table. Equidistant from both edges. No letter. She considered a letter. She was a good writer. Surgical, clear, capable of building an argument that could take down a ministry in 3 paragraphs. She had drafted the trade accords that opened the eastern ports. She had written the epidemic protocols that cut the fever mortality rate in the border settlements by 60% in 2 years. She could have written a letter. She decided against it, because a letter would give him language to respond to, and she was not ready to receive language from him. Not yet. Perhaps not for a long time. And because the sigil said what needed to be said, the sigil said, "I know, I was not fooled, and I have made a decision." She changed her clothes, put on the rough wool traveling clothes she kept at the bottom of the cedar chest, kept there for reasons she had never examined closely and would now stop wondering about. Packed a healer's satchel with the essentials: instruments, medications, the frontier province papers she had kept current without ever telling anyone why. She had kept those papers current for 3 years, another thing she had not examined closely. She braided her hair herself. Her hands were steady. She was 31 years old, 4 months pregnant, though only she knew it, and the queen of Duskspire. She walked out through the servant gate at the 3rd midnight bell without looking back. The winter took her in like it had been expecting her. The servant gate opened onto a narrow alley that ran along the mountain face behind the palace, used by supply wagons before dawn. Seris knew the patrol rotation. She had learned it early in her time at Duskspire, not out of any plan to leave, but because she was a woman who had learned as a child that knowing exits was survival, not paranoia, and some lessons outlast the circumstances that teach them. She moved through the alley in the dark without a torch. The mountain cold hit her immediately, the kind that comes off northern stone in winter and has no mercy in it, only clarity. She was 100 yards from the gate when she heard boots behind her. She stopped, turned. Mira, her chambermaid, 19 years old, born in the lower city, sharp as a field knife, stood at the alley's edge with a traveling cloak in her arms and an expression of furious loyalty on her face. "My lady." "No," Seris said immediately. "You're not going alone." "Mira." Her voice was not soft. It was the voice she used in the infirmary when she needed someone to stop arguing and listen. What's behind that gate right now is a queen. What walks out of this alley in 10 minutes is a woman named Saren, who came up from the eastern provinces with a healer's certification and no remarkable history. A queen needs a maid. Saren does not. Mira's jaw tightened. She was the kind of girl who cried from anger, not from weakness, and her eyes were dangerously bright. "I know what I heard tonight. I know where you're going. At least let me—" "Stop!" Seris crossed the space between them in 4 steps, took Mira's face in both hands, those hands that had just set down a vow sigil and packed a satchel and remained steady throughout. She looked at her directly. "You did not see me leave. You found the chamber empty at the fourth bell when you came to build the morning fire. That is the truth, you know. That is the only truth you have. A beat. Do you understand me? Mira's jaw worked. Mira. Yes, my lady, she whispered. Then fiercer. He doesn't deserve you. That is no longer the relevant question. Seris released her, took the traveling cloak from her arms, because she was not foolish enough to refuse good equipment when it was offered, and put it on. Go back inside. Stay warm. Keep your head down for the next several weeks. Morvaine's people will be watching for anyone who might know something. What do I say when he asks? The king? Seris considered this for half a second. Tell him the chamber was cold. She turned toward the alley's end. It was. She did not look back. The alley led out onto a livestock trail that wound down the mountain's eastern face. In summer, it was a trade path. In midwinter, it was a scar in the snow, barely a foot wide, used only by the most stubborn supply runners who refused to pay the toll road rates. Seris had memorized it from the cartographic surveys she had filed in her own study. She moved downward through the dark and cold, the wind off the mountain working at her cloak with impersonal hostility, and she did not cry. The crying would come eventually. She was not so efficient a machine as to pretend otherwise to herself. But right now, with the palace still visible above her as a cluster of amber lights in the Black Mountain, crying was a resource expenditure she could not afford. Instead, she thought, the child. 4 months. She had not told Vylor because she had wanted the timing to be right, had wanted to tell him in a way that felt clean and intentional and not like a fact being weaponized in the middle of a court that was always looking for leverage. She had been waiting for the right moment. She understood now that there was a particular cruelty in careful timing. It meant the right moment could be stolen from you by someone else's wrong one. She pressed her hand briefly to her abdomen. The rough wool was cold. Beneath it, nothing had changed. Life was impervious to tonight's events in a way that Seris found simultaneously grounding and devastating. She kept moving. Plus, 3 weeks and 4 settlement crossings later, Seris sat in a roadside shelter 30 miles east of the last provincial checkpoint and ate cold flatbread across a fire from a retired military surgeon named Aldrich, who had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a blade infection and now worked the frontier circuit, tending to anyone who couldn't reach a city. He was 60, sun-ruined, and possessed of the particular no-nonsense outlook of someone who had spent a career being the only medical professional within 100 miles of disaster. You've got the hands of someone who trained proper, he said, not looking up from the bread. Where out of? Valshir province. He had clearly heard 100 names for 100 places that might or might not exist. You got somewhere you're going or somewhere you're going from? Seris looked at the fire. The second one. Fair enough. He broke his bread. There's a settlement 3 days northeast called Hollowmere. It's under the northern cliffs. Frost 9 months out of 12, ugly as sin in winter, but they're good people and they've got no physician at the moment. Last one got married to a merchant and moved south. Town's been asking around. She looked at him. I'm not running a placement service, he said. Just telling you what I know. You can do with it what you want. She did with it what she wanted. Hollowmere was every hard thing Aldrich had described and nothing he hadn't mentioned. The northern cliffs rose behind it like a wall that the weather had been throwing itself against since the beginning of recorded time and had not yet succeeded in moving. The settlement was 200 souls in rough stone buildings, a central well, a livestock pen, a small market that operated 3 days a week, and a communal hall where major decisions got argued out around long tables with blunt honesty that Seris found, after 6 years of court diplomacy, almost physically relieving. She arrived on a gray afternoon in the second month of winter, asked at the market for the village council leader, and was pointed toward a heavy-set woman named Tiva, who was in the middle of mending a fence post and did not stop doing so when Seris introduced herself. Serene of Valshir, Teva repeated, not skeptically, but with the evaluative tone of someone who had seen a lot of people arrive with a name and a story and was doing the math. You're a physician. I am. We've got no money to pay city rates. I have no city rates. Teva looked at her hands, looked at her face, looked with particular attention at the slight roundness under the traveling cloak that Seris had stopped trying to hide from sharp-eyed women. When? 5 months.
Hmm. Tiva drove the fence post another inch into the frozen ground with a mallet. We've got a stone house on the north end. It needs work. The hearth draws well, which is the only thing that matters. You can have it in exchange for the first 6 months of basic care for the settlement. Agreed, Seris said immediately. You don't want to negotiate? No. Tiva looked at her for another long moment. You from court? The question landed without warning, and Seris felt it in her sternum. No, she said. Her voice was level. I'm from the road. Mm-hmm. Tiva went back to the fence post. House is on the left past the well. Keys under the stone by the door. Get yourself warm. We'll talk more tomorrow. Seris walked to the house. Let herself in. The hearth did draw well. She built a fire with wood from the stack outside and sat on the floor in front of it in her traveling cloak because there was no furniture yet. And for the first time since the corridor, she let herself exist in the full weight of what had happened and what she had done and what came next. It took a long time. She did not break, but she bent. That was allowed. Bending was not breaking. She had told that to patients for years. Now she told it to herself with the same clinical exactness and discovered that it was still true, and that true things do not become easier simply because you know them. The fire burned. The wind worked at the stone walls. Seris sat in the cold house in the frontier settlement, 300 miles from the palace where she had left a vow sigil on a table without a word, and she said to herself, to no one, to the child who did not yet know where they had been born into, I am going to be all right, and I am going to make sure you are all right, and I am going to rebuild every single thing that matters from the ground up, with my own hands, and it is going to hold because I built it. It was not a speech. It was a directive. She was that kind of person. She got up, started figuring out where they kept the spare blankets. The child came in early spring, delivered by Seris herself with assistance from Hollowmere's senior midwife, a woman named Kala, who had large, quiet hands and the unflappable efficiency of someone who had attended 300 births and considered unnecessary drama a medical complication. Push, Kala said, not for the first time. I'm aware, Seris said through her teeth, which was somewhat impressive given the circumstances. Just making sure. Kala. Pushing, yes, I see it. He arrived in the early gray light of a thaw morning with an expression of profound offense at having been moved from his previous arrangement, which Kala found hilarious, and Seris found reasonable. She held him in both arms and felt the impossible specific weight of him and thought, there you are, in a voice inside her head that she had never used for anything before. She named him Kalen. It was her father's name, from the frontier province, from before the healer training and the court and all of it. It was a name that belonged to a world before Obsidian and Empire. He had Veilor's stillness. That was the thing that struck her in the first weeks and continued to strike her in the months that followed. The way the child could fix his gaze on something and simply watch it with that unnerving, assessing, absolutely unreadable patience. She had seen that expression on exactly one other face in her life. She did not let herself linger there. Hollowmere had its own rhythms, and Seris learned them the way she learned everything, with attention and without shortcuts. Winter was isolation and conservation and the particular intimacy of a community that had to depend on itself. Spring was mud and urgency, every stored-up problem arriving simultaneously for treatment. Summer was brief and genuinely beautiful, the northern cliffs turning amber in the long-angled light, the settlement's small fields producing enough that nobody went hungry. She was good here, not in the sense of merely adequate, in the sense of being the right instrument for the right environment, sharp, adaptable, without ornament. Hollowmere did not need a queen. It needed someone who could set a broken leg at midnight in a cold barn and not complain about the cold or the hour, and that she could do in her sleep. Kalen grew. He walked at 10 months, which Kala said was early and Teva said was trouble. He spoke in deliberate, well-formed sentences, which everyone agreed was slightly unnerving for a child not yet 2. He helped in the way small children help by creating additional work while believing themselves essential. Seris explained things to him directly rather than in the simplified language most adults defaulted to, and he responded to that with the seriousness of someone who had decided to take the world at its word. She taught him herb identification when he was old enough to walk the field paths without toppling into everything.
She taught him what clean water looked like versus contaminated. She taught him how to read from a medical text first and a storybook second, not because she was rigid, but because she wanted him to understand from the beginning that knowledge was not ornamental. She did not teach him anything about Duskspire, not because she was hiding it, because he was 2 and then 3, and there was no version of that conversation that was appropriate yet. And because when she tried to compose it in her own mind, she found that it required a framework she had not finished building. What she knew was this. He would have to know eventually. He would have to understand what he was, what blood he carried, what that meant. The world would not permit permanent ignorance. The world had its own timeline for these things, always had, and it had no particular interest in anyone's readiness. She was preparing. Mata. It was Teva who first mentioned it. 3 winters after Seris had arrived, on a night when the wind off the cliffs had driven everyone indoors, and half the settlement was gathered in the communal hall around whatever warmth and food could be shared, Teva appeared at Seris's elbow with 2 cups of something hot, and an expression that meant conversation was incoming. "There's been a man asking in Frostgate," she said, low-voiced, nodding toward the hall's noise to cover them. Frostgate was the nearest town, a day's travel south. "Doesn't fit. Good horse, good clothes, asking about a woman healer with a young boy, Eastern Province's origins." Seris's hand tightened on the cup. I didn't say this," Teva continued, "but he had the kind of coin he spent without counting it, and the kind of face that spent years not being told no. That's a specific kind of face." "How long ago?" "Word came in this morning. 3 days, maybe." Seris was quiet for a long moment. "Serin," Teva said, using the name with a gentleness she rarely deployed. "If there's something coming, I'd rather know." Seris looked across the hall to where Kaelin was sitting with the blacksmith's youngest, building an architecture of small wooden blocks with the serious collaborative focus of very young engineers. His dark hair caught the firelight. He had his father's profile. She had noticed that more lately, as his face was leaving the indeterminate softness of infancy and beginning to resolve into the particular angles it would carry for the rest of his life. "I know," she said. "I'll tell you." She turned back to Teva. "But not tonight." Teva accepted this with a nod that contained equal parts respect and the quiet marking of an IOU. Seris finished her drink, let the noise of the hall wash over her, watched Kaelin negotiate with the blacksmith's boy over the structural integrity of a wall. 1 scout, Frostgate, 3 days, which meant within the week. She closed her eyes briefly, breathed, opened them. She had known this was coming. She had been a fool to think otherwise, or perhaps she had not been a fool. Perhaps she had simply needed the 3 years. Perhaps 3 years was what it took to rebuild a person from the inside out, stone by careful stone, in a place with no mirrors that reflected empire. Perhaps she had needed to know, with absolute certainty, that she could survive without Duskspire before she could think clearly about what, if anything, Duskspire had left that was worth the conversation. She did not know yet what she would say when he arrived. She did know that for the first time in 3 years, the bond that had screamed in that corridor had shifted, not warmed, not healed, but changed pitch, the way a held note changes when the room's acoustics change. He was closer. And she was not the woman he had betrayed anymore. She was something his fear had made without meaning to, harder, cleaner, irrevocably hers. The fire cracked. Kaelin's tower fell, and he began rebuilding it immediately, without frustration, with the same patient stillness she had spent 3 years watching and recognizing and refusing to name aloud. She wondered if he would come alone. She wondered what his face would look like when he first saw his son. She wondered what she would do with the part of herself that had never stopped knowing he was alive out there, in the dark of a world they used to rule together. She wondered none of these things long. There was a patient with a chest cough who needed checking in the morning. Kaelin's boot had sprung a seam that needed repair, and the North stores were running low on a particular moss herb she used for fever reduction. Tomorrow was full of things that mattered, but somewhere on the southern road, a king was riding north without his banners. And the woman he was coming to find had already decided that whoever he was when he arrived, she was going to make him stand in the cold for a while before she opened the door. The scout's name was Aaron, and he had been riding for Valor Ashrin for 11 years, without ever once questioning an order, until the morning the king told him to leave his colors behind. All of them? Aaron had said, standing in the pre-dawn dark of the stable yard with the kind of expression a man gets when the architecture of his world shifts by 3 degrees. All of them, Valor confirmed. He was already saddling his own horse, which was its own kind of statement. Kings did not saddle their own horses. This king, on this morning, was doing it himself with the focused efficiency of someone who needed to be moving before he stopped moving altogether. Aaron had looked at the unmarked saddlebags, at the plain traveling cloak already in place, at the king's face, which was the face of a man who had not slept in a manner that could be called sleeping for a considerable length of time. And the escort? There's no escort. My lord, Aaron. The voice was not raised. It was something worse than raised. It was the voice Valor used in the war chamber when the discussion was finished and what followed was implementation. I'm riding north alone. If I am not back in 30 days, Councillor Davin has the interim authority documents. That is all. Aaron had been a scout for 11 years. He knew how to read terrain. He knew how to read men. He looked at his king in that stable yard and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has spent a decade watching a person under pressure, that this was not a military operation. This was a man going to do something that frightened him considerably more than war. Yes, my lord, Aaron said. Valor rode out before the first light touched the mountain. There is something worth understanding about kings who ride without their banners. It is not humility, not precisely. A man who has spent his adult life as the axis around which an empire rotates does not simply shed that weight the way one removes a cloak. The weight is structural. It has reorganized his spine. It has rewritten the way other people's eyes move when they look at him, and more critically, it has rewritten the way he reads those eyes. Take away the banners and the escort and the royal decree, and you have not made a humble man. You have made a powerful man stripped of his instruments, which is an entirely different condition, and in some ways a more dangerous one. What you have is a man forced to operate on unfamiliar ground. Valor had been in that condition before. Early in his rule, before the empire consolidated, there had been seasons in the field where authority was theoretical and survival was the only argument that mattered. He had not been comfortable in those seasons. He had been effective. There is a difference. Comfort requires a certain settling of the self into circumstances. Effectiveness requires only that the self remain functional under load. He was functional. He rode north through the first day without stopping except to water the horse. The territories south of the frontier were familiar. The same rolling farmland and timber settlements that supplied the empire's eastern resources. The same provincial roads he knew from tax reports and military surveys. But known from paper is different from known from the road. And after years in the palace, the physical reality of the country had a roughness to it that the reports had filtered out. The mud on the roads was real mud. The cold was genuinely cold. The distance between settlements was longer than it looked on maps, because maps were optimistic about distance, the way administrators were optimistic about timelines. He did not find this unpleasant. That surprised him. He had expected the absence of the palace machinery to feel like amputation. Instead, somewhere around the end of the first day, it felt more like something he had been carrying had been briefly set down. He was not sure what to do with that observation. He filed it. By the third day, he had crossed into the frontier territories, and the terrain changed its character. The farming settlements thinned out. The roads became suggestions. The sky got bigger in a way that had nothing to do with actual measurement and everything to do with the absence of walls. He ate at a roadside shelter among a mixed group of traders and a family relocating east, sitting on the same bench as everyone else, eating the same food, and nobody recognized him, which was a strange and not entirely unwelcome experience. A woman across the table asked where he was headed. North, he said. Business or family? He looked at the fire for a moment. Family, he said, and the word felt like a thing he had not handled in a long time, like a tool he knew the purpose of, but had to relearn the grip. He arrived at Frostgate on the 5th day, made the inquiry that Tiva would hear about within hours, and understood immediately from the way the question was received. The careful non-answers, the polite ignorance that was too well coordinated to be accidental, that whoever he was looking for had built something here, had roots, had people around her who were paying attention. That told him more than any direct answer would have. He did not push. He paid for a night at the inn, ate, slept for the first time in days in a way that could actually be called sleep,
and in the morning rode northeast on the road to Hollowmere. He had 3 days of riding to think about what he was going to say. He used all 3 of them and still did not have a satisfactory answer. The problem, he had come to understand, was that he had spent his entire life being someone who walked into rooms with a prepared position. Governance was that. War was that. Even the things that were supposed to be personal had, over the years, taken on the structure of managed outcomes. He decided things. He executed decisions. The empire ran on the principle that his judgment was reliable and his authority was clear. That structure had served him extremely well for a long time. It had also, he was beginning to understand with the particular dawning clarity of a man who has been very good at not understanding something, been a way of never being genuinely exposed to anything. You could not be wrong if you were always the one deciding what was right. You could not be inadequate if the standard was yours. You could not be abandoned if you never fully allowed arrival, except he had allowed it once, with her. And then he had destroyed it in a way so precisely calibrated to his own deepest fear that it had the quality of something almost designed, as if some part of him had engineered a reason to run before the thing he feared could take it from him first. He thought about that for 3 days on a cold northern road. He did not arrive at peace with it. He arrived at comprehension, which is the necessary predecessor to peace but should not be confused with it. He understood what he had done and why. Understanding was not the same as absolution. Understanding was just the beginning of the longer, harder work. The northern cliffs appeared on the morning of the 3rd day, a wall of gray stone rising above frost-covered terrain like something permanent and indifferent. Below them, at a distance that took another 2 hours to close, sat Hollowmere. He slowed his horse at the settlement's edge. 200 souls, roughly. Stone buildings tight against the cold. A central well. Smoke from a dozen hearths. The smell of livestock and pine and wood smoke, and something else underneath it all. The particular smell of a community that has learned to be sufficient to itself. He had administered enough frontier settlements from a distance to know what this place was. Functional, proud in the particular way of people who do not rely on anyone's help, and deeply attentive to strangers. 3 separate sets of eyes were on him before he had passed the first building. He rode to the well and dismounted. A heavy-set woman was there with a water bucket, looking at him with the particular expression of someone who had been expecting something unpleasant and had decided to meet it standing up. She had the kind of face that had spent decades outside. Her hands were large and work-roughened. She set the bucket down. "You're the one who was asking in Frostgate," she said. Not a question. "I am." "Coin spent without counting. That's what I heard." She looked at his horse, his clothes, his hands. "You've got the build of a soldier. Too old for active service, so either you're retired or you outrank it." Valor looked at her steadily. "My name is Vailor." Something shifted in her eyes, just a degree, but it was there. "Is it? I'm not here with authority. I'm not here with a decree or guards or any claim on anything in this settlement." He held her gaze. "I'm here because I need to see her, and I am asking." Teva, he would learn her name later, studied him for a long, unhurried moment. The kind of moment that could not be rushed without revealing exactly what you needed, which was information, and giving it away before the negotiation started. "She knows you're coming," Teva said finally, "has since yesterday." A beat. "She didn't leave." He absorbed that. "Stone house on the north end," Teva said. "Past the well, left side." She picked up her bucket. "She'll open it or she won't. That's not my part." She walked away without another word. He led his horse north. The house was modest in the way things are modest when someone has spent time making them functional rather than comfortable, and then gradually, almost reluctantly, added the small evidence of life. A frost-resistant plant in a clay pot by the door, a child's boot sitting on the step with the unconscious casualness of something that belonged there, a curl of smoke from the chimney that indicated a fire built hours ago and maintained since. He stopped outside. The door opened before he knocked. She looked at him from the doorway. He had been trying to prepare for this. He had tried for 3 days on a cold road, and he now understood that there was no preparation for this. There was only the reality of her, standing in that doorway, and the reality was that she looked nothing like the woman he had been carrying in memory for 3 years. Memory had kept her as he last saw her, queen-polished, palace-lit, armored in the particular way of a woman who had learned to navigate court. The woman in this doorway wore rough work clothes and a practical braid, and had hands that were chapped from winter work, and an expression that was not welcoming and not hostile, and was something considerably more difficult to manage than either. She looked like herself, the real version, the one underneath everything. "I wondered how long it would take," she said. Her voice was the same, dry and direct and carrying the particular weight of someone who thinks before they speak and means what they say. "Too long," he said. She looked at him for another moment, then stepped back from the doorway. Not an invitation exactly, more of an acknowledgement that the conversation was going to happen and the cold was not a useful addition. He entered. The house was one main room with a stone hearth, a work table covered in the organized materials of medical practice, a sleeping area behind a curtain, and the accumulated evidence of a life built from scratch. A child's drawings on the wall, a shelf of medical texts with broken spines from use, a pair of small boots near the hearth, 2 cups on the table that suggested she had made tea before he arrived, which told him everything about the quality of her control. She had prepared. He had come unguarded. She had prepared. There was a lesson in that asymmetry. She crossed to the work table and stood with it between them, not aggressively, just with the ease of someone who had thought about where to stand and had chosen deliberately. She picked up a cup and held it in both hands. "You found Frostgate in 5 days," she said. "That's faster than I expected. I wrote alone." "I know." Something moved in her expression. "That surprised me." "Did it?" "Yes." She looked at him over the cup. "You don't do things that way. You move with apparatus. You make the machinery of arrival part of the statement." "I didn't want to make a statement." "Then what did you want to make?" He looked at her. The direct answer was the only one available. "Contact," he said. "I wanted to make contact." The room was quiet. The fire breathed. 3 years, she said. "Yes. I need you to understand something before we go any further." Her voice had not changed pitch or pace. It remained what it was, measured, clear, carrying the same quality as a blade that has been properly maintained. Not angry. Anger would have been easier. "I'm not standing here because I have been waiting. I'm standing here because I built a life in this place, and that life is here. And when you showed up at my door, I had a choice about whether to open it. I opened it. That's the extent of the welcome. I understand." "Do you?" She set the cup down. "Because I have watched powerful men claim to understand things for a long time. And what they usually mean is that they have heard the words and cataloged them while continuing to operate on their original framework. That is probably accurate for who I was." "And who are you now?" The question sat between them. He had thought about it on the road. He had not arrived at a clean answer. He gave her the unclean one. "I don't know exactly. I know I'm not the same man who stood in that war chamber and convinced himself that what he was doing was separate from what mattered." He watched her face. "I know that's not enough. I know it's not a credential." "No," she agreed. "It's not." This is the thing that breaks kings open, when it finally happens. Not the loss of territory, not the loss of power, not even the loss of the battle. It is the moment they are forced to stand in a room with the full accounting of themselves and cannot manage the narrative. Valor had controlled narratives his entire adult life. He had controlled the story of the Ash Dominion, the story of the Wolf King, the story of every alliance and every conquest and every carefully managed piece of court diplomacy. He had been, in this as in other things, very good. In this room, in this small stone house, with a woman who had been a physician longer than she had been a queen, and who was looking at him with eyes that were performing a differential diagnosis on everything he said, there was no narrative to manage. There was only what was true. He sat down on the bench near the hearth without being invited, not because he was asserting dominance, but because he was genuinely tired in a way that had nothing to do with the road. She watched him do it, did not object. "Tell me about the child," he said. Something changed in the room, not dramatically, just a shift in the molecular weight of the air. "His name is Kalen," she said. "How old?" 2.5. She paused. "He has your stillness. I noticed it early." I didn't want to notice it. Valor looked at the fire. Where is he? With a neighbor. I arranged it this morning. A beat. I wanted to talk to you first. Before. She did not finish the sentence. Before he sees me, he said. Before I decide whether he should. The words landed with the precision of someone who had chosen them carefully. This is how she fought. Not with volume. With clarity. With the particular devastating competence of a woman who had spent 3 years deciding exactly what she would and would not surrender. He absorbed it. That's your right, he said. It's not a negotiating position, she said, with an edge in it now. I'm not offering it for you to agree with. I'm telling you how it is. I know. He looked at her. I came here without anything to offer except showing up. I know that. I know it's not a transaction. I'm not here to negotiate Kaelin. I'm not here to invoke bond law or right of succession or any claim on this household. Then why are you here? Because I needed to see you were all right. His voice was level. Because I have spent 3 years knowing you were alive somewhere and not knowing what kind of alive, and not knowing if you were... He stopped, pressed his jaw. I needed to see you with my own eyes. The silence was different this time. I'm all right, she said quietly. Yes, he said. I can see that. Another silence. The fire cracked. You look terrible, she said. He exhaled once through his nose. I know. When did you last sleep properly? Frostgate. 3 nights ago. She gave him the look she gave patients who had been mismanaging their own condition. He recognized it from 6 years of watching her direct it at everyone else, and understood, with a complicated rush of something he didn't immediately name, that being on the receiving end of it meant she was still paying attention to whether he lived or died, which was a form of information. There's food, she said. Sit. Eat. I need to think. He sat. She fed him without ceremony bread and a hot broth from the pot on the hearth, and they ate in a silence that was not comfortable but was functional. And he ate everything because he was genuinely hungry, and because refusing would have been a kind of posturing he no longer had the interest in maintaining. Afterward, she cleared the table with the efficient movements of someone whose hands were always doing something. You exiled Serene, she said. It was not a question. Before sunrise, the day you left. And Morvain. Systematically. It took 8 months to fully dismantle his influence without triggering a council crisis. Davin and I worked it in stages. He paused. It's done. She nodded once, not warmly, not coldly, with the precision of someone filing a piece of information in the correct location. That was never the point, she said. I know. The point was never that they existed. The point was the choice you made. She turned to face him. I need you to understand the difference. Punishing them was about your pride, possibly about your guilt. It was not about me. He met her eyes. You're right. I know I am. No satisfaction in it, just fact. I've spent 3 years being right about things. It doesn't fix anything. This is the specific education that loss provides to powerful people when they are willing to receive it, that being right is the beginning of comprehension, not the end of it. Valor had run an empire on the assumption that correct decisions produced correct outcomes. What he had not accounted for was that some decisions could be correct and still cost you everything that mattered. What he had not accounted for was that the people he loved were not variables in an equation. They were people. They would carry the weight of his choices in their own bodies and make their own determinations, and those determinations did not require his agreement. Seris had made a determination. She had made it with a vow sigil on a table in the middle of the night, and 300 miles of winter road, and 2.5 years of building something real in a place where nobody cared about obsidian crowns. He had to stand inside that determination and work with what it was. I want to earn something back, he said. I don't know what yet. I don't know what you'd be willing to consider. I'm not asking for a decision right now. I'm asking for the possibility of a conversation. She looked at him for a long time. You'll stay in Hollowmere for a few days, she said finally. There's an inn at the south end. You'll keep your name to yourself. You'll ask nothing and you'll push nothing. You will meet Kaelin when I decide it's time. You will not touch anything in this house or this settlement that isn't offered to you. She held his gaze. And you will answer me honestly when I ask you something, regardless of whether the honest answer helps you. That is the only offer on the table. Yes, he said, without hesitation. She searched his face. "Why did you really do it?" she said. "Not the court reason, not the political reading. I want the one underneath." He had known this question was coming. He had been afraid of this question the way he was afraid of very little else, because it required him to stand in territory he had spent his entire life fortifying against examination.
"Because you were the only thing I had ever encountered that I could not manage," he said. "I could not predict you. I could not fully control the terms of your presence in my life, and that meant I could lose you at any moment without any action I took being sufficient to prevent it." He held steady under her gaze. "So somewhere in the machinery of myself, I did the losing first, before you could." The room was very quiet. "That," she said, "is the most honest thing you have ever said to me." "I know. And it is also the most catastrophic thing you have ever said to me." "I know that too." She turned away, stood at the window looking out at the frost-covered fields. The northern cliffs were gray against the gray sky. A child's laugh came from somewhere down the settlement's main path, faint and clear as a bell in cold air. Both of them heard it at the same moment. Neither of them moved. "He builds things," she said quietly. "He has your patience and my stubbornness, and he is currently the best argument I have for the possibility that people can be more than the worst thing their parents ever did." Baylor's chest did something he had not given it permission to do. He kept his face still, but it was closer than it had been in a long time. "He asked me this morning," she continued, still facing the window, "why some fathers don't live with their families. I told him it was complicated. He thought about it for a while and then told me that complicated was just another word for something people hadn't finished solving yet." Baylor stared at the back of her head. "He is 2.5, she said. "I heard you." She turned then. Her eyes were dry. Her face was the composed, dangerous face of a woman who had made her decisions and was living inside them with her whole self. "I'm not going to make this easy for you," she said. "I don't want it easy." "You don't get to want things right now," she said, with a precision that was not cruel but was absolute. "Right now you get to be here and be quiet and demonstrate over a period of time that the man who rode north alone is a different man than the one who made choices in the dark. That is all." He held her gaze. "Understood," he said. She crossed to the door and opened it, letting in a blade of cold air. "Inn is at the south end," she said. "I'll send word when it's time." He stood, crossed to the door, stopped in the frame. "Seris?" She waited. "Thank you," he said, "for opening the door." She looked at him with those eyes that had seen everything and processed everything and were currently processing him with the same merciless accuracy she brought to a diagnosis. "Don't make me regret it," she said. He walked out into the cold. She closed the door behind him and stood in the quiet of her house with the hearth fire and the medical texts and the child's drawings on the wall and pressed one hand flat against the door and breathed. Once. The way she had breathed in a corridor 3 years ago, pressing her palm against cold marble, deciding who she was going to be. She was still deciding. That was the thing that nobody understood about strength. It was not a conclusion. It was not a state you arrived at and maintained effortlessly. It was a daily decision made in the spaces between other decisions, made in the moments when the easier option was available and visible and required only that you stop paying attention. She was still paying attention. Outside, his boots crunched on the frost path. She did not move from the door. Then Kalen's laugh reached her again from down the path, closer now, and she heard the particular running child percussion of small boots that hadn't quite mastered the balance of full speed, and she stepped back from the door and turned, and her son came through the front door with color in his cheeks and a question already forming on his face about what was for supper. She answered him, fed him, heard about his afternoon in the precise and slightly tangential narrative style of a very young person who had opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them at length. She put him to bed herself that night, sitting on the edge of his sleeping mat in the low firelight, while he fought the heaviness of his eyes with the stubbornness she had mentioned to Veilor, and she thought, with the particular clarity that comes in the quiet of a child nearly asleep, about the next morning, and the morning after that, and what it would look like eventually to let her son see his father chop wood, and whether the man who had ridden north without his banners was capable of the things she had not yet said aloud to anyone, that she did not want to rebuild what they had.
She wanted to see if something different could be built, something that knew its own fault lines from the beginning and was constructed accordingly. She wanted to see if he had the patience for that kind of work. She had a feeling she was about to find out. Down the settlement's main path, in the South End Inn, a king without a crown was lying on a narrow inn bed, staring at the ceiling of a room that smelled of pine resin and old wool. And he was not sleeping, and he was not planning, and he was not managing any outcome. He was simply lying in the dark of a frontier town, feeling, with acute and unfamiliar precision, that everything he had spent his life building had led him here, to this narrow bed, to this settlement under the northern cliffs, to the prospect of earning back something that no conquest had ever been complicated enough to prepare him for, and that tomorrow he might, if she sent word, if she decided, if she judged him sufficient for this one specific morning, be allowed to meet his son. He was not sure he had ever been more afraid of anything. He was, underneath the fear, more awake than he had been in 3 years. Outside, the northern cliff stood against the dark sky, and somewhere between this inn and the stone house at the north end, Hollowmere breathed in its winter sleep, carrying in its ordinary walls an extraordinary weight, two people who had survived each other, trying to determine whether survival was enough to build on. Neither of them knew the answer yet, but for the first time they were in the same settlement, and morning was coming. And the ground between them, still frozen, still waiting, had somehow been prepared for the first time for something to be planted in it. Something that had no guarantee of growing and no certainty of surviving the frost, but that had been brought here by a man riding alone without his banners and a woman who had opened a door she could have kept shut. The fire in the inn burned low. The fire in the stone house held. And somewhere in Duskspire, a high council was watching the calendar and watching the borders and watching the empty throne-side chair where a queen had once sat with a healer's satchel and a mind sharp enough to cut stone. And the ministers who had spent years calculating her absence were beginning, with the slow dread of men who had underestimated something critical, to calculate her return. They did not know she was already deciding. They did not know that the Wolf King had ridden to a frontier settlement without his teeth and was lying in a narrow inn bed learning, for the first time in his life, that some things could not be taken. They could only be given. And that everything now, depended on whether he was finally someone worth giving them to. Morning came to Hollowmere the way it always did in the deep frost months, without ceremony, without warmth, without any particular interest in the people it found there. The light arrived gray and flat off the northern cliffs, and it illuminated the settlement with the same indifferent precision it used on the frozen fields and the livestock pens and the smoke rising from 24 hearths into an iron sky. Veilor was awake before it. He had slept 4 hours, which was more than he expected and less than he needed, and he lay in the narrow inn bed listening to Hollowmere wake up. The particular acoustic texture of a working settlement in winter, the livestock sounds, the distant clang of the blacksmith's morning work, the voices carrying in the cold air with the clarity that only frost produces. And he thought about what Seris had said. The complicated was just another word for something people hadn't finished solving yet. That a 2.5-year-old had arrived at that conclusion by himself. He got up, washed his face in the basin of water that had developed a thin skin of ice overnight, dressed, went downstairs. The innkeeper, a lean man named Paul, who had the economical manner of someone who had run a frontier establishment long enough to find most things unsurprising, put bread and hot grain in front of him without being asked, and then went back to his own business. Veilor ate, looked out the small window at the settlement's main path, watched Hollowmere operate. He was on his 3rd day. Seris had sent word on the 2nd morning, not to him directly but through Teva, which told him something about the architecture of the system she had built here, the way trust moved through the settlement in particular channels, the way his presence was being managed by people who were paying careful attention to where he was and what he was doing at all times. He did not find this offensive, he found it appropriate. He had arrived in a community built by a woman who had learned in the hardest possible way what it cost to trust without infrastructure. Of course, there was infrastructure. The word had said, "Come to the house at mid-morning. Bring nothing." He had gone. Teva had been there, sitting at the table with a cup and the specific body language of a woman who was present as a structural element rather than a social one. Seris had been at the work table. Kaelin had been on the floor with a collection of smooth river stones arranged in a pattern that appeared to have internal logic.
The boy had looked up. Valor had stood in the doorway, and Kaelin had looked at him with those eyes. Seris's watchful assessment married to something else, something that lived in the bone structure and the quality of stillness, and said with the directness of a child who had not yet learned to soften inquiry with social lubrication. "You're the man from yesterday." "I am," Valor said. "My mother knows you." "Yes." Kaelin considered this information with the seriousness he apparently brought to everything. Then he held up one of the river stones. "Do you know what this kind is called?" Valor crossed the room and crouched down to the boy's level, looked at the stone. Gray, striated, a particular kind of layered rock from mountain runoff. "That's schist," he said. Kaelin looked at the stone, looked at him. "How do you know?" "There's a lot of it in the mountains where I come from." "Where do you come from?" "South," Valor said. "A long way south." "That's not very specific," Kaelin said. Behind him, from the direction of the work table, Valor heard something that might have been Seris suppressing a reaction. He kept his face straight. "You're right," he said. "It isn't." Those 2 days had been the strangest of Valor's life, which was a significant statement given the inventory of things his life had contained. He had chopped the wood that Seris indicated needed chopping, doing it with focused attention in the side yard while Kaelin sat on the stone step and watched him with the evaluative interest of a small person determining whether an adult was competent at something. He had repaired a section of fence at Tiva's direction, working alongside the settlement's carpenter in companionable silence, while the carpenter very deliberately did not ask him anything. He had carried water from the well to the storage cistern behind the healer's house, 3 trips, and on the second trip Kaelin had appeared beside him and informed him that the proper way to carry 2 buckets was to balance the weight evenly on both arms, which was correct and which he had been doing. "I know," Valor said. "You were leaning right," Kaelin said. "I was compensating for the uneven ground." Kaelin looked at the ground, looked at the buckets. "Oh," he said, and appeared to file this as genuinely useful information. He had not spoken directly with Seris beyond the functional. She was watching. She was always watching, with that particular quality of attention she brought to diagnoses, cataloging data, refusing to reach conclusions before the evidence supported them. He understood this. He did not push for more. He had told her he would keep his mouth shut and demonstrate, and he was demonstrating, and it was both the most difficult and the most honest thing he had done in years. On the morning of the 4th day, the rider arrived from Duskspire. Valor was at the well when he saw the horse come up the southern road at a pace that was not urgent enough to indicate military emergency, but was considerably faster than travel. The horse was a Duskspire-bred animal. He knew the lines, knew the build. The rider was young, post-rider age, wearing nondescript clothes over a Duskspire courier insignia that was partially concealed but not well enough. He kept his face neutral, set down his bucket. The rider found him within minutes, of course. Someone had given directions, and pulled up with the controlled urgency of a person delivering something they had been told was time-sensitive. "My lord," low-voiced, eyes moving to check the perimeter. "Speak," Valor said. "Counselor Davin sends word. He apologizes for the breach of your instructions regarding contact. He says you will understand when you hear it." Valor looked at him. "Then tell me." "Chancellor Morvain has returned to the capital." The cold air had a different quality suddenly. "When?" 6 days ago. He entered through the western gate with a private escort. 14 men, Lord, armed. He went directly to the Councilor's Hall and invoked the Emergency Succession Charter. Valor was very still. The Emergency Succession Charter was a document that had existed in Duskspire's governance structure for 200 years. It had been invoked exactly twice in that history. It allowed the High Council, under extraordinary circumstances, to call for a declaration of heir incompetency against a sitting monarch, requiring a full council vote within 30 days. The circumstances defined as extraordinary were deliberately vague. The charter had been written by men who wanted flexibility. It had been left in the governance structure by every subsequent ruler who assumed they would never need to worry about it because they were not the kind of ruler it would be used against. Morvain had spent 8 months watching Valor systematically dismantle his political infrastructure. He had spent 3 years in comfortable exile calculating his re-entry. He had waited until the king was 300 miles from the capital, without escort, without official documentation of his location, and with a high council that had grown, in his absence, uncertain about the succession. And then he had walked back through the western gate with 14 armed men and invoked a charter that gave him 30 days. 24 days remained. "There's more," the writer said. "Tell me." He brought a document, a sworn testimony from Lady Serene. She claims. The writer paused with the expression of someone delivering a thing they would rather not be responsible for. She claims that the queen left Duskspire not of her own will, that she was removed, exiled, by your order. The silence that followed was the kind that has mass. That the queen's disappearance was a royal act of political elimination, the writer continued, designed to clear the succession line for a preferred heir, and that the child, if one exists, was the primary reason for the removal. Valor looked out at the northern cliffs. This was the design. This had been the design from the moment Morvain entered the western gate. Not a simple power grab. Those were straightforward, and straightforward things could be countered with straightforward force. This was architecture. Serene's testimony, whether true or false, whether believed or simply repeated loudly enough, reframed every fact in evidence. Seris's absence became an act of royal cruelty. Kaelin's existence became not an heir but a victim. And Valor, standing 300 miles from his capital without banners or escort, looked exactly like a man who had driven his queen out and was now scrambling to contain the fallout. The worst lies are built around true facts, arranged in wrong sequence. He had been in Hollowmere for 4 days. To anyone watching from Duskspire, that looked like a man attempting a reunion that was too little and too late, which Morvain's people would use to confirm that the queen had indeed required compelling to return, which would confirm the testimony, which would give the council enough uncertainty to vote. 24 days. "Is Davin holding?" Valor asked. "He is, my lord. But 3 council members have already signaled openness to the motion. If Morvain gets 4 more in the next week, he won't need 4 more if he gets confirmation that the queen is alive and won't return voluntarily." Valor looked at the rider. "Does Morvain know where I am?" "Not precisely. He knows you rode north alone. His people are asking in the frontier towns." They would find Frostgate within days. From Frostgate to Hollowmere was a single road. He did not have the luxury of another week of quiet wood chopping. He sent the rider south with instructions for Davin. Specific, detailed, written in the abbreviated tactical shorthand they had developed during the border campaigns, the kind that looked like inventory notes to anyone who intercepted it. Then he stood at the well for 2 minutes, alone, looking at the northern cliffs and the gray sky and the smoke from the stone house at the north end. And he thought about what came next with the unsparing precision of someone who could not afford to think about it any other way. Then he walked to Seris's house. She answered the door before he knocked. She had been watching from the window. Of course she had. She took one look at his face and stepped aside. "Sit down," she said. He sat. He told her. He told her all of it, without softening and without management, because she had asked for honesty regardless of whether the honest answer helped him. And this honest answer helped neither of them, and he gave it to her anyway. She stood at the work table with her arms crossed and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something that had multiple moving parts. That particular quality of internal assembly, the way a physician looks when they are connecting symptoms to cause to consequence in real time. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "Serene's testimony," she said. "Yes." "Fabricated." "Yes, but not easily disproven." Her voice was flat and precise. "Because the facts it arranges are all real facts. I'm gone. Kaelin exists. You're here alone. The sequence is wrong, but the evidence is available to multiple interpretations," he said. "Yes." She uncrossed her arms, turned to the window. Outside, Kaelin's voice carried from somewhere down the path, arguing with cheerful intensity about something with the blacksmith's boy. She did not look in that direction. She was looking at the cliffs. "You need me to come back," she said. It was not a question. He said nothing. She turned. "Say it. I need you to come back," he said. "I need the council to see you and Kaelin in Duskspire, present and uncompelled, before Morvain gets 4 more votes. I need your testimony against Serene's. I need—" He stopped, pressed the words flat. I need you to walk back into that palace, which you left because I gave you every reason to, and I need you to do it within the next 20 days. The room was quiet. The fire breathed. This is the particular brutality of political marriage in an imperial context. It does not allow the luxury of personal timelines. The private and the political share the same body, and when one is under assault, the other cannot simply withdraw to recover at its own pace. Seris had spent 3 years building a life precisely calibrated to her own terms, and now those terms were being disrupted not by Valor's desire, but by Morvaine's calculation, a man who understood, with the instinct of a predator who had been watching a wound, exactly when to press. Power is not neutral. Power creates enemies specifically because of its existence, and those enemies do not pause their operations out of courtesy to the personal crises of the people who hold it. Morvaine had waited 3 years. He had waited for the moment when the king was most exposed and the queen was most distant, and the gap between them was most impossible to close quickly. He had done this deliberately. It was, from a purely technical standpoint, an impressive piece of political engineering. Seris understood all of this. She had understood imperial politics before she ever arrived in Duskspire. She had watched courts operate since she was a physician attached to a frontier governor's household at 22 years old, and she had learned then what she had spent 6 years in Duskspire confirming, that power structures do not care about the health of the people inside them. They care about their own continuity. They generate their own weather, and the people who live under that weather adapt or they get damaged, and there is very little middle ground. She had adapted. She was being asked to adapt again, under different terms on a timeline she had not chosen. If I come back, she said, I come back on my conditions. Yes. Not as a political instrument, not as evidence in your defense, as a sovereign. Her eyes were direct and hard. Full authority restored. My study, my medical work, my independent correspondence with the provincial governors, no management, no court protocol used to limit my movement or access. Agreed. Kaelin is formally recognized, not quietly, not as a footnote in a succession document, formally, public decree. I've already drafted the documentation. It's been sitting in Davin's office for 8 months waiting. Something moved in her expression at that. Brief. Gone before it fully resolved. You drafted it 8 months ago, she said. Yes. Without knowing whether I'd ever come back. Yes? She looked at him. Why? She said. He met her gaze. Because he deserved it regardless of what you decided. Because it was right. Because... He stopped. The next part was harder. Because doing the right thing in the empty room, when there's no one watching and nothing to gain from it, is the only version of right that actually means anything. She was quiet for a moment. Tiva taught you that, she said. I figured it out somewhere between here and Duskspire, he said, on a cold road with no banners. She looked away. There's something else, she said. Yes. You know what I'm going to ask? He waited. She turned back. If I walk into that palace and stand beside you in front of that council, I am doing it for Kaelin's protection and for the stability of the settlements that depend on the Dominion's governance, the frontier towns, the people who would suffer through a succession crisis. I am not doing it because we are healed. I am not doing it because you asked. I know. And you need to stand in front of your council and say that. Not imply it. Say it, that I returned of my own determination, that no claim was made on me, that if anything, I am the one with terms. I will. Because if you make this look like a reclamation, she said, with a quiet that was sharper than anything raised, I will leave again, and the next time there will be no conversation at the door. He held her gaze without flinching. Understood. She turned from him and called out through the back of the house for Calla, whose voice returned from somewhere nearby indicating she was available. Then Seris came back to the table and sat across from him for the first time, which was its own kind of landmark. 20 days, she said. If we leave within 2. I need 1 day to make arrangements for my patients here. Calla can handle most of it, but there are 2 complex cases I need to document properly and transition. She said this with the same tone she would have used discussing supply logistics, which told him that she was not performing practicality. This was just how she functioned under pressure. It always had been. Teva will manage the rest. She's been managing most of it for years. He nodded. Kalen, she said. He doesn't know what Duskspire is. He doesn't know what he is. He knows we're going south because there's something important that needs to be done. That is all he knows until I decide he's ready to know more. Yes. And when the council sees him for the first time, she said, you will stand next to him, not in front of him, not managing how they see him, next to him, because he is not a prop in your defense. He is my son, Valor said. The words sat differently in the room than he expected. More weight, more reality. The fact of Kalen as a concept was one thing. The fact of Kalen as a small person who knew what schist was and had corrected his bucket-carrying form and argued with an innkeeper's logic about vague geographical answers was something that had gotten into him over 4 days in ways he had not catalogued until the words were out of his mouth. He is my son, not a political statement, a fact. Seris was looking at him with an expression he could not fully read. Yes, she said quietly. He is. The preparations took the rest of the day and into the evening. Seris worked without pause and without drama, transitioning her patient cases with the focused efficiency of a physician who had done field medicine in conditions that made Hollowmere look lavish. Tiva came and went, carrying information and decisions, and when the two women stood in the main room in the late afternoon reviewing the arrangement of ongoing care, there was a conversation that Valor was not part of and did not attempt to be part of, conducted in the low, direct shorthand of people who trusted each other completely. He sat outside on the stone step in the cold. Kalen came and sat next to him. We're going south tomorrow, Kalen said. Yes. My mother says it's important. It is. Kalen was quiet for a moment. He had a small piece of schist in his hand, the one he'd shown Valor on the first day. He turned it over and looked at it. Are you going to be there? Where we're going? Valor looked at the northern cliffs. Yes. Good, Kalen said, with the matter-of-fact ease of someone who had made a decision and was at peace with it. He put the stone in his pocket. I like schist. I'm bringing it. Valor looked at his son in the last light of the afternoon. That's a good idea, he said. That night, after Kalen was asleep, Seris stood in the doorway between the main room and the sleeping area for a long moment with her arms crossed in that expression she got when she was calculating the full cost of a decision she had already made. I need to say something, she said. Valor, sitting at the table with the tactical correspondence for Davin, looked up. I'm going back because it's the right thing, she said. I'm going back for Kalen's future and for the people in the border settlements who have no say in what Morvain does to the governance structure if he wins this. I am going back because I understand what is at stake better than anyone in that council chamber. She held his gaze. But I want you to understand what it costs me to walk back into that palace. I want you to understand it in your body, not just your head. He put down the correspondence. Tell me, he said. I built everything here from nothing, she said. I built it from the ground up, with my own hands, in a place where nobody knew my name or cared about my title, and I built it well. I built a practice and a community, and a life for my son that has value and dignity and does not require anyone's permission. Her voice was not breaking. It was harder than that. It was the sound of someone holding a thing very steady that wanted to move. Walking back through that gate means accepting that I cannot protect him from the weight of what he is. It means accepting that the world I tried to give him, small, real, sufficient, cannot be enough anymore because Morvan made a calculation. It means accepting that I have to fight for things in a context I left for good reasons. He waited. I need you to understand that I am not returning to you, she said. I am returning to the obligation. Those are different things. She paused. We are somewhere in the middle of something I don't have a name for yet. I need you to not pretend that's resolved. I won't, he said. You are going to want to, she said. Once we're back and the council settles and Kalen is established and the immediate crisis is over, you're going to want to treat the fact of my presence as evidence of restoration. I am telling you now, don't. He looked at her for a long moment. I hear you, he said. I will not rush it. I will not manage it. I will not treat your presence as a settled account. She studied him. The quality of that study was the same as the first night. The differential diagnosis, the looking for what was underneath the stated position. You've changed, she said. It was not a warm statement. It was precise. A clinical observation. Yes, he said. I don't know yet if it's enough.
I know you don't.
She nodded once, with the finality of a physician who has completed the day's assessment and is moving to the next task. Be ready at first light, she said. She went behind the curtain. He sat at the table with the correspondence and the fire and the darkness outside and the cold coming through the stone walls. And he thought about what she had said about cost, about the life she was setting down, about the fact that the right thing and the wanted thing rarely lived in the same location, and that the difference between a ruler and a man who merely held power was whether you could distinguish between them when it mattered. He thought about Morvain in the counselor's hall with Cyrene's testimony and 14 armed men in 24 days on the clock. He thought about a boy with a piece of schist in his pocket who was going to wake up tomorrow and find out that South was a great deal more specific than it had been presented. He thought about an empire that was about to discover that the queen it had watched disappear was coming back differently than she had left, and that different was not less, and that the council members who had spent 3 years calculating the widow's walk political advantage of her absence were about to find out exactly how badly they had miscalculated the cost. He did not sleep. He planned, because he was Vaelor Ashrin, and when his back was against the wall, what emerged was not desperation. It was the cold, exact, absolute focus of a man who had built an empire from blood and strategy and had been, until recently, incapable of applying that same ferocity to anything more important. Morvain had given him 24 days. He was going to use 19. And when he walked back through the gates of Duskspire, beside the woman he had betrayed and the son he had never held, and the life he had nearly destroyed with his own hands, he was going to make it clear to every man in that counselor's hall that the charter Morvain had invoked was the last political instrument the chancellor would ever touch. But that was the empire. First there was mourning. First there was a child who needed to be told that South was a mountain citadel, and that the cliffs waiting for him were not northern gray but black, and that the wolves on the banners were not decoration but declaration. First there was Seris crossing a gate she had left on a winter night 3 years ago, and everything that required of her, and everything he owed her for it. The fire burned to coals. Outside, the northern cliffs stood in the dark and said nothing. Tomorrow, Hollowmere would watch them go. And somewhere in Duskspire, Morvain was sleeping soundly in the certainty that he had calculated correctly. He had made one error. He had calculated for the King Vaelor used to be. He had not accounted for what 3 years of absence and 4 days in a frontier settlement and 1 conversation at a door had produced. He had not accounted for a man who had learned at considerable cost the difference between holding power and deserving it. That error was going to be expensive. They left Hollowmere at first light on a morning so cold the horse's breath came in visible bursts, and the frost on the path cracked under boot like thin glass. Tiva stood at the settlement's edge with her arms crossed and her jaw set, in the expression of a woman who had strong opinions about the situation and had made her peace with keeping them to herself. Calla was beside her, smaller and quieter, with the particular stillness of someone who understood that goodbyes conducted efficiently were a kindness. Seris embraced Calla first, not long, not theatrical, the grip of 2 people who had delivered life together in cold rooms and trusted each other's hands. "You'll send word," Calla said. "I'll send word," Seris confirmed. "Then Teva." Seris stepped back and looked at her, and Tiva looked back, and something passed between them that had no need of language because it had been built over 3 winters of shared work and shared cold, and the particular intimacy of people who have seen each other at their most functional and their most exhausted. "You know where the house is if it goes wrong," Tiva said. "It won't go wrong," Seris said. "If it does, then yes, I know where the house is." Teva's eyes moved to Vaelor, standing with the horses at a distance that said he understood his position in this particular farewell. She looked at him for a long moment with the evaluative directness she had used on the first day at the well. "You break what she's built," Tiva said, flat and clear, "and I will personally ride south and make your life considerably more difficult than any council vote." Vaelor held her gaze. "I believe you." "Good." Tiva picked up her bucket and walked back into the settlement without further ceremony. Kalen was already at the horse. He had been ready since before dawn, awake and dressed and sitting at the table with his piece of schist and his traveling pack with the serious preparedness of a child who had decided that this journey was important and intended to approach it accordingly. He had asked 2 questions at breakfast: how many days south and whether there would be mountains.
Seris had answered both. He had eaten his grain, put the schist in his pocket, and been ready to go. Now he looked up at the horse with the assessing expression he brought to new structural problems. "It's big," he said. "Yes," Valor said. "Can I ride with you?" Seris looked at Valor, a look that contained a complete set of parameters and permissions and the specific notation that this was not a concession but a child's request to which he was invited to respond appropriately. "If you want to," Valor said. Kalen held up his arms. Valor lifted him. The weight of the boy was specific and real in a way that no preparation had adequately represented. The particular solid warmth of a small person who trusted, completely and without reservation, the hands that were holding him. Kalen settled in front of him on the horse with the efficiency of someone getting comfortable for a long journey and looked out at the road ahead with calm interest. Seris mounted her own horse without comment. They rode south. The first day was silence and frost, and the long, rolling terrain of the frontier territories opening out before them. Kalen asked questions for approximately the first 3 hours with the inexhaustible inquiry of a very young person for whom everything visible was data worth requesting explanation of, and Valor answered them. The names of birds, the composition of different road surfaces, the reason some trees kept their leaves in winter and some didn't, with the direct factual accuracy of someone who had governed territories long enough to know their natural history. By midday, Kalen was asleep against his arm, with the complete confidence of a child who had decided the man holding the reins was adequate for the purpose. Seris watched this from the corner of her eye and said nothing. She was thinking about Dusk Spire. She had not let herself think about it at length in 3 years because thinking about it at length served no functional purpose, and she was a person who did not spend resources on things that served no functional purpose. But now it was ahead of her on a road that had a specific endpoint, and she let herself think about it with the same clinical precision she brought to everything else. The palace, the black marble corridors, the amber torchlight, the particular quality of sound in a place built for power, the way voices carried differently in those halls, the way silence had a different density. Her study on the second floor with the provincial correspondence and the healer's ledgers and the pressed flower frame from home. The infirmary ward off the east wing where she had spent more genuinely useful hours than in any throne room or council chamber. She thought about the council members who had watched her disappear and calculated the advantages of her absence. About Morvain in the counselor's hall with his testimony and his 14 men and his 24-day clock that now had 19 days left on it. About Serene, wherever she was, having signed a document that called Seris's departure an exile and her son a political liability. She thought about what it meant to walk back into a place carrying everything she had built in her absence and refusing to set any of it down. There is a particular kind of strength that only becomes available after you have survived losing everything you thought you needed. Seris had not known this until she found herself in a cold stone house in Hollowmere, with a dying fire and a pregnancy and 300 miles of winter road behind her. She had rebuilt herself in that house, in that settlement, in those 3 years of work that nobody had assigned her, and nobody had supervised and nobody had evaluated except the people she was serving. And what she had discovered in the rebuilding was that she was considerably more than the palace had required her to be. She was going back now with that understanding intact. Morvain had calculated for a displaced queen. He had not calculated for a physician who had spent 3 years doing real work in hard conditions and had no remaining illusions about what she was capable of or what she was owed. She rode south and her jaw was set and her hands on the reins were steady. 19 days. They stopped the first night at a frontier inn 40 miles south of Hollowmere. Valor took the room across the hall from Seris and Kalen without being asked and said nothing about the arrangement except to confirm the morning departure time. Kalen ate supper with the focused appetite of a child who had spent a day on horseback and then immediately fell asleep on the inn bed, still holding the piece of schist, which Seris extracted from his hand with practiced care and set on the windowsill where he would see it when he woke. She and Valor sat at the common table downstairs for an hour after Kalen was asleep. Not warmly, not as restored things, as two people who had a shared logistical problem and the mutual competence to address it. He laid out the council situation from Davin's correspondence with the same precise tactical clarity he brought to military planning. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she asked 4 questions, each one aimed at a different structural vulnerability in the strategy,
and his answers were direct and acknowledged 2 of her 4 concerns as valid complications. Morvain's testimony rests on Cyrene as the sole sworn witness, she said, which means its power is entirely dependent on the council's willingness to treat her word as credible against my direct counter-testimony. Yes, then the first thing we do when we arrive is not the council chamber. The first thing is a public audience. My presence, Kaelin's presence, witnessed by enough people in the capital that the testimony's entire premise collapses before Morvain gets to make his formal argument. Valor looked at her. That's more effective than a council counter-argument, yes. She did not say it with satisfaction. She said it with the same tone she used for clinical assessments. A document can be argued. A living person in a public square cannot. We make it impossible to sustain the narrative before we ever walk into the chamber. He was quiet for a moment. You've been thinking about this since Hollowmere, he said. I've been thinking about this since you told me about Morvain, she said. I had 19 days to plan, and I used the road. Something moved in his expression, a recognition, the specific look of someone seeing a person clearly for the first time in a long time, or seeing clearly something they had allowed themselves to forget. Yes, he said, public audience first. You're right. They worked for another hour. When they went upstairs, they went to separate rooms, and in the morning, they rode south with the particular focused quiet of 2 people who had a deadline and a plan and the combined competence to execute it. The days collapsed under the horses' hooves. Frontier territories became provincial roads, became the wider, better-maintained highways of the Inner Empire. And as they rode deeper south, the landscape changed, and the political weather changed with it. They passed through 3 provincial capitals where Seris was recognized, despite 3 years of absence, with the particular quality of attention that a person gets when the people around them suddenly recalibrate their sense of what is happening. Word moved faster than horses. She knew this. She counted on it. By the time they were 5 days out from Duskspire, Davin's courier met them on the road with updated intelligence. Morvain had acquired 2 more council votes. 4 were now formally aligned with his motion. He needed 3 more for a majority. He had 14 days. They had 9. The courier also brought a separate piece of intelligence that Davin had flagged as urgent. Morvain's 14 armed men were not a personal escort. They were a reorganized fragment of the Chancellor's old household guard, technically demobilized 8 months ago when Vialor had dismantled Morvain's political structure. Technically private citizens. Technically. Their camp was outside the western gate in a formation that anyone who had commanded troops would recognize as a holding position, not a residence. Morvain was not just making a political argument, he was making a threat. Valor read the courier's report twice. Seris read it once, which was enough. He's prepared for you to come back and contest the vote, she said. He's prepared for the council to be close. He's not prepared to lose cleanly, so he's made sure he doesn't have to. If the vote fails and I'm standing in Duskspire with my full authority restored, those 14 men are a liability, Valor said. He needs the vote to succeed, or he needs the situation to become complicated enough that authority itself becomes unclear. Which means if we arrive and the public audience works and the council starts moving against him, he needs a different instrument. She looked at the road ahead. 9 days. 8 by the time we arrive. She nodded once. Then she looked behind her at Kaelin, who was riding with the courier's youngest horse on a leading rein and concentrating with intense absorption on keeping his position. He cannot be in the city when we do this, she said, low-voiced. Valor looked at her. Davin has a house outside the eastern gate. Trusted household. I can have him there with 2 of Davin's personal guards before we make the public entrance. 2 guards isn't enough if Morvain decides to make things complicated. 4. Kala isn't here. She said this with the flat factual acknowledgement of someone noting a resource gap. He's going to be in an unfamiliar place with people he doesn't know, which he will accept because he's Kaelin and he accepts things that are explained to him as necessary, but I need the explanation to be honest. Then we explain it honestly. She looked at him. He's 2.5, she said. He corrected my bucket-carrying form, Valor said. He deserves an honest explanation. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said. He does. That night, in a provincial inn 2 days from the capital, Seris sat on the edge of Kaelin's bed and explained in the direct language she always used with him that they were going to a city that had walls and towers and a great many people, and that before they went to the important part of the city, she needed him to stay for a short time with a man named Davin, who was trustworthy and would have good food, and that this was because the important part of the city had a disagreement happening that needed to be handled first by the adults, and that he was safe and she would come to him as soon as the disagreement was settled. Kaelin listened to all of this with his stone in his hand and his eyes on her face. "Is it dangerous?" he asked. She looked at him. "Some disagreements have a sharp edge," she said. "I'm going to make sure it stays sheathed." "How?" "By being very clear and very loud about what is true," she said. Kaelin thought about this. "And if the other people don't listen?" "Then your father handles the part that comes after." Kaelin looked past her to the doorway, where Violor was standing with his arms crossed. He looked at him for a long moment with those assessing eyes. "Okay," he said. He put the stone on the pillow beside him. "Tell me when it's done." She kissed his forehead. He was asleep in 3 minutes. In the hallway, Violor said, "He took that better than most adults." "He trusts the information he's given," Seris said, "because he's always been given accurate information." She looked at Violor. "That's what trust is built from, accuracy over time." He held her gaze and received the full weight of the statement without deflecting. "Yes," he said. "It is." They arrived at Duskspire on the 8th morning. The mountain rose out of the winter landscape with the particular authority of something that had existed since before anyone alive had a name for it, and at its peak the black towers of the citadel caught the morning light and threw it back in hard silver angles. The obsidian wolves on the outer banners were visible from 2 miles out. The imperial road that led to the main gate was wide enough for 8 horses abreast, and had been kept clear of ice by the gate garrison, and as they came up the final approach, Seris felt the palace's weight before she saw its details. That particular pressure of a place dense with history and consequence, the specific gravity of walls that had absorbed decades of decisions with real costs. She had not expected to feel it as intensely as she did. She kept her face forward and her back straight and her hands steady on the reins. Kaelin was already with Davin, safely east of the city, with 4 guards and a promise. She had told him. He had accepted it. She and Vaelor came up the main road with no escort, no banners, no decree. Just 2 riders on winter-wet horses in traveling clothes that had accumulated 9 days of road on them. The gate garrison saw them at a quarter mile and something changed in their posture. The specific recalibration of soldiers who have just processed visual information that did not match their expected parameters. The gate captain came forward. He saw Vaelor, he saw Seris. He opened his mouth and then closed it, and then opened it again, with the expression of a man whose entire operational framework had just been revised. "My lord!" Then, with the weight of someone choosing words carefully in a moment that felt historic. "My lady." "Open the main gate," Valor said, "full width." "My lord, the Chancellor's men are—" "Open the main gate," Vaelor repeated, not louder, with the specific quality of a voice that has been the final word in enough rooms that it no longer needs volume to function as finality. The gate opened. They rode in. This is what nobody adequately prepares for when they think about power. It is not primarily about force. Force is the instrument of last resort. Power, real power, the kind that builds and sustains empires rather than merely holding them at sword's point, is about legibility. About being unmistakably, undeniably present in a way that changes the calculations of every person in the room. Vaelor had understood this in the abstract for years. What he had not understood, until this morning, was that the same principle applied to the kind of return that could not be managed or stage-directed because it was simply true. Seris riding through the main gate of Duskspire was a fact. Facts are not arguable. Word moved through the palace the way fire moves through dry timber. Not fast, but with absolute authority, and no regard for who it found in its path. By the time they had crossed the main courtyard and reached the palace's inner gate, people were in windows, in doorways, on balconies. The kitchen staff, the laundry workers, the lower household servants who lived inside the palace machinery and knew its weather better than any minister, these were the first ones, the ones who had always been paying the closest attention, and what Seris saw on their faces was not the managed deference of a court performance. It was recognition. She had been the queen who came into the infirmary ward at midnight for a soldier with a shattered radius. She had been the physician who sat beside the dying without distance. She had been, in the day-to-day reality of the palace's working life, present in ways that court functions never required, and she had done anyway, because that was who she was. They remembered. Morvaine's people were in the counselor's hall. The intelligence was 6 hours old, but the hall was where Morvaine operated, where his political architecture lived, and there was no reason to expect he had moved. Valor knew this building the way a general knows a battlefield he has walked in daylight before commanding it in the dark. Every door, every sight line, every point of acoustic advantage and structural vulnerability. He dismounted in the inner courtyard. She dismounted beside him. He looked at her across the horses.
"You know it doesn't have to be today," he said. "We can establish presence, let word move, use the night." "Today," she said, "while the road is still on us, while it's real and visible and unmanaged." She held his gaze. "The most powerful testimony I can give is the one where I walk in there directly from the frontier road without having stopped to put on court clothes." He understood. "Then we go now," he said. They went now. Counselor Davin intercepted them in the corridor outside the main hall with the expression of a man who had been managing an emergency for 6 days and had just seen the emergency resolve itself and was not yet certain he was reading the situation correctly. He was 60, thin, with the permanently alert posture of someone who spent his professional life in rooms where things were decided. "My lord." His eyes moved to Seris. "My lady, the council is in session. Morvaine called an early meeting this morning. He has 6 members present. He needs 1 more for a quorum, and Brel arrived an hour ago, which gives him 7. "Location," Valor said. "Main hall. His men are—" Davin's voice went flat. "They're inside the hall, my lord, 4 of them. He brought them in this morning under the argument that the charter proceedings allow for the presence of charter sponsor security." Seris said, "That's not what the charter says." "No," Davin agreed. "It is not. But by the time the objection was formally raised and processed, the men were already seated, and Morvaine had a sympathetic chair for the session." "Who's chairing?" Valor asked. "Councillor Wren." A beat. Wren was one of the 3 members Valor had flagged as movable, not committed to Morvaine, but not committed to resistance either. The precise type that pressure turned. "Then we go in while Wren can still be moved," Seris said. She started walking. Valor fell in beside her. Davin fell in on his other side with the grim efficiency of a man who had been running interference for 6 days and was deeply relieved to be running it for someone who knew what they were doing. The counselor's hall occupied the center of the palace's administrative wing, a high-ceilinged room designed to make the people inside it feel appropriately weighed by history. Black stone walls, high windows letting in winter light, a long rectangular table seating 12 with the chair positions color-coded by seniority. When the door opened from the outside, the sound hit before the light, voices in the particular register of men conducting a formal proceeding, the dry administrative cadence of a process underway. The guard on the door looked at Valor and went still. "Open it," Valor said. The guard opened it. The hall went quiet the way rooms go quiet when the thing they were talking about walks into the room. Not gradually, not politely, but with the abrupt completeness of a word cut off mid-syllable. 7 council members, Morvaine at the far end standing as if he had been mid-sentence, which he had. 4 armed men positioned at intervals along the wall in the studied casual manner of people who are pretending to be furniture. Councillor Wren in the chair, mouth slightly open. 6 faces doing the rapid recalculation of people whose operational framework had just been revised. Morvaine's face did something more controlled than the others. He was a man who had spent his life in rooms like this, and he had the political discipline not to show the full measure of what he was feeling when the door opened. What showed was a fraction, a tightening around the eyes, a stillness in the jaw. He had calculated well. He had not calculated for this morning. Seris walked to the center of the room and stopped. This is what composure looks like in its most effective form. It does not announce itself. It does not perform. It simply occupies space with an absolute certainty about its right to be there that makes any counter-argument feel structurally unsound before it is made. Seris stood in the center of the counselor's hall, in traveling clothes with 9 days of road on her, and looked at the room with eyes that had spent 3 years looking at things that mattered and were not going to be impressed by a meeting table. "I understand," she said, at a volume that carried without effort,
that there is a document in front of this council claiming I was removed from Duskspire by royal decree and that my son's existence represents a political elimination action. She looked at Morvain. I am Seris, sovereign consort of the Ash Dominion. I am standing in this hall. I invite anyone present to explain to me how an eliminated person arrived here on her own horse. The room was silent. Morvain said, My lady, your return does not— I am not finished, she said. He stopped. The document you are operating from was signed by Cyrene Vale, who has a documented and specific personal interest in the framing of my departure, who was exiled from this palace by royal decree the morning after the events she claims justify her testimony, and who has spent 3 years in a position where her social and political rehabilitation depends on creating a narrative that removes her personal culpability from the record. She held Morvain's gaze. I will give full sworn testimony before this council regarding the circumstances of my departure. I will do it today, in this room, in front of every member present, and when I am finished, I will ask this council to apply the same evidentiary standard to both documents. Councillor Wren said carefully, My lady, the proceedings are formally— Wren, Valor's voice from the doorway. He had not moved from the entrance. He did not need to. The room knew where he was. The proceedings are formally in question, given that they were initiated on the basis of a document that has just been directly contradicted by the subject of the document's presence in this room under her own power. The Charter requires that all primary evidence be reviewed before a vote. New primary evidence has arrived. He looked at Wren with the particular steadiness of a man who is not threatening anyone and is not required to. The proceedings pause. Wren looked at Morvain. Morvain looked at the table. This is the anatomy of a calculation failing in real time. Morvain had built his architecture on an absence. The absence was the foundation. Every argument, every aligned vote, every piece of narrative construction he had spent 3 years engineering rested on the physical fact of Seris not being in Duskspire. He had calculated arrival as a possibility and had prepared counterarguments. He had not calculated for a woman who walked into a room looking like she had ridden 9 days to be exactly here, who spoke with the calm authority of someone who had spent those 9 days deciding exactly what she was going to say, and who was making his testimony look like what it was, an arrangement of true facts in a wrong sequence designed to benefit a specific interest. He had one instrument left. My lady's testimony is welcome, Morvain said, with the controlled smoothness of a man switching positions without appearing to move. The council, of course, defers to the Chancellor. Seris's voice cut across the smoothness with the clean precision of someone who recognizes a retreat being disguised as accommodation. You walked into this hall 6 days ago with 14 armed men, invoked an emergency charter on the basis of a single sworn document from a single witness with a documented personal interest, and moved immediately to a vote timeline that allowed no opportunity for counter-testimony. You did not defer then. Do not perform deference now. The room was very still. Morvain's jaw tightened, the fraction that his discipline permitted. The council, he began. The council, Valor said, moving into the room now. The quiet certainty of his movement, the specific kind that fills space, not through aggression, but through irreversible presence, will hear my wife's testimony. Then it will render a judgment on the charter motion, and then— He reached the head of the table and stopped, looking at Morvain across its length. We will discuss the composition and purpose of the 14 men currently camped outside the western gate. Morvain looked at him. The 2 men faced each other across the length of the table, and the specific calculation each was running was visible only in the quality of the silence, the kind of silence that has more than one layer, where the surface is governance and the floor is something older and colder and considerably more direct. There are moments in the life of powerful men when everything they have built narrows to a single room and a single decision, and the full weight of their choices arrives at the same time from every direction. Morvain had spent 3 years constructing a return. He had built it carefully, patiently, with the intelligence of someone who understood that the right moment was more valuable than the right argument. He had arrived in Duskspire with his testimony and his men and his aligned council votes in a 24-day window, and he had been 6 days into that window when the door of the councilor's hall opened. He had one move left. The 4 armed men were still in the room. They had not moved since the door opened because trained men in a professional capacity do not move without instruction. And Morvan had not given instruction because he was still calculating whether the move was available. Veilor saw him calculating. This is what a decade and a half of command produces in the body. A specific sensitivity to the moment before a decision, the particular quality of stillness in a person who is about to authorize something. It is not dramatic. It is quiet. It looks like nothing. It feels to someone who knows how to read it like the half second before a loaded mechanism releases. Veilor said, "Don't." Morvain looked at him. "Whatever calculation you're running right now," Veilor said, "don't run it to the end, because the end of that calculation has consequences that don't serve anyone in this room, including you." Morvain's jaw was set. "You walked back in here," he said, with the specific precision of a man who has decided to put his cards on the table because the alternative is watching them be taken. "You walked in here without escort, without military force, alone with a woman you drove out 3 years ago, thinking that presence is enough, that showing up is the argument." His voice carried the accumulated cold of 3 years of exile. "You dismantled everything I built, everything my family spent 2 generations building in this court. You did it methodically, deliberately, without mercy and without appeal, and you called it governance. And now you stand there and tell me don't." The room was not breathing. "I built the Eastern trade expansion," Morvain continued. "I built the provincial tax reform. I built the diplomatic architecture that kept the northern clans at the table instead of at the border. I built the infrastructure of this empire while you were fighting border wars, and you took it apart because your queen left and you needed something to punish." His eyes moved to Seris. "And she came back. So now you think you win." Seris said, "This isn't about winning." Morvain looked at her. "You think that's what I'm here for?" she said. "To win?" Something in her voice that was not anger and was considerably more authoritative than anger. "I'm here because 14 armed men outside a city gate and an emergency charter invoked on false testimony is a threat to the stability of every settlement that depends on this governance structure. I'm here because the people in the frontier territories and the border provinces and the eastern trade settlements are real people whose lives are affected by what happens in this room, and they don't have a voice in this council chamber, and someone has to walk in here and remind this room that governance is not a personal dispute." The silence that followed this was different from the others. It had the specific quality of something true said in a room full of people who had been operating in comfortable abstractions. Councillor Wren said very quietly, "My lady, if you would give your testimony, the council will hear it." Morvain looked at his 4 armed men. They looked at him. The calculation ran its final length. He sat down, not with defeat, with the particular controlled movement of a man who is repositioning, who is accepting that this specific approach has been countered and is already planning the next one. A man like Morvain did not have one instrument. He had many. The retreat of one was not the end of the campaign. His face said this clearly to anyone who knew how to read it. Veilor knew how to read it. He filed the information. He would deal with it, but not in this room, not in this moment. Seris took the chair that Wren indicated, and she gave her testimony. She gave it in the flat, precise language of someone who had been a physician long enough to understand that the most effective recounting of events is the one stripped of interpretation and composed entirely of verifiable fact. She gave dates, locations, the precise sequence of events, the contents of every decision she had made and why, and she gave it without passion and without performance because she did not need passion and performance. She had the facts. She had been there. She was sitting in the chair alive and present and uncompelled, and there was no document in Morvain's possession that could survive direct contact with the person it had claimed to describe. The council listened. When she finished, the vote was called. 8 members present, 6 required. The motion failed. Morvain did not react. That was the thing that Veilor watched with the specific attention of a man who had been the axis of power long enough to know when the absence of reaction was more informative than reaction. A man who has truly lost shows it. A man who has merely changed terrain does not. Morvain stood when the vote was recorded, straightened his jacket with the precise care of someone whose composure was a professional instrument, looked at Veilor across the table. "My lord," he said. "Chancellor," Veilor said. Morvain turned and walked toward the door. His 4 men fell in around him. He reached the door. He stopped. He did not turn back.
He spoke to the door. The eastern trade routes your queen protected, he said. The provincial governance architecture she maintained. The diplomatic relationships with the northern clans. A pause. When those begin to fracture, and they will begin to fracture because the people who maintained them have been removed, I want you to remember that this was a choice you made. He walked out. The door closed behind him. The room breathed. Valor stood at the head of the table and looked at the door for exactly the length of time it took to confirm that what he had just heard was what he thought he had heard. Not a threat of violence, not a political declaration, but something older and in certain ways more dangerous than either. A promise. Morvain was not finished. He had lost the instrument. He had not lost the intent. He had walked out of the counselor's hall with his men and his calculation and his 3 years of accumulated cold, and he had told Valor precisely what field the next engagement would be fought on. Not a council chamber. The Empire itself. Valor looked at Seris. She was still in the testimony chair, hands flat on the table, looking at the closed door with the expression she got when she was processing something that had multiple moving parts. He just told us what he's going to do, she said. Yes. He's going to let us win this room and then fracture the infrastructure that makes the win meaningful. Yes. She looked at him. The eastern trade routes, the provincial governors he has relationships with, the northern clan diplomatic channels. I know. We have, she calculated, weeks before the first fracture point, maybe less. She stood. We need Davin. We need the full infrastructure map. We need to know every relationship Morvain built that we dismantled and whether it can be rebuilt under different terms. Agreed. She was already moving. This is what genuine competence looks like when it operates at full capacity. It does not pause to acknowledge the victory. It sees the next problem and moves. Seris crossed the counselor's hall with the stride of a woman who had just testified her way through a charter challenge and was already 3 steps into the next problem, and the council members who were still in their chairs watched her go with the expressions of people who were revising their operational frameworks in real time. Valor looked at Ren. You voted right, he said. Ren looked at his hands. I voted the evidence, he said. That's what I'm supposed to do. Yes, Valor said. It is. He followed Seris out of the hall. She was in the corridor, already talking to Davin with a focused efficiency that was covering something. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the fraction of tension that her composure was holding down. She had walked into that hall and testified and won, and was already managing the next thing because that was how she survived every room she'd ever been in. He stopped beside her. Kaelin, he said quietly. She turned. He's safe, Davin confirmed. House is secure. He asked for you approximately 40 minutes ago and was told you were occupied with something important. He accepted this and asked whether there was schist in the East Garden. Seris made a sound that was not quite a laugh and was not quite something else. We can go, Valor said. She looked at him. Davin can start the infrastructure mapping, he said. Morvain isn't moving today. Today is over. He held her gaze. Our son is 40 minutes from this gate waiting to hear it's done. She stood in the corridor with the counselor's hall behind her and the palace walls around her and everything she had left and returned to pressing down from every direction. 20 days ago, she said, I was in Hollowmere. Yes. And you were in a narrow inn bed in Frostgate. Yes. And now we're here. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that had diagnosed everything and were now doing the thing they did when they were trying to determine whether the evidence supported the conclusion they were not yet willing to reach. Then she turned and walked toward the eastern gate. He fell in beside her. Outside the palace walls, somewhere in the city, Morvain was walking with his 4 men and his calculation and his promise about fracture points, and he was not finished, and they both knew he was not finished. And the empire ahead of them had the specific, complicated weight of something that needed to be rebuilt from the inside while someone outside was already looking for the seams. But at the eastern house, 40 minutes away, a 2.5-year-old boy with a piece of schist in his pocket was waiting to hear it was done. Everything else would have to stand in line. The winter light was thin and cold on the mountain. The black towers rose above them. The wolves on the banners moved in the wind. And behind the wall of a counselor's hall with an empty table and a failed vote,
A man with 3 years of cold patience and an empire's worth of political infrastructure was sitting in a city he had walked back into with 14 men and a plan, looking at the revised terrain and beginning to calculate the next instrument. He had not lost. He had changed ground, and the next move was already forming in the space behind his eyes, where ambition and patience had lived together for 3 years, growing sharp in the dark. Neither Vialor nor Seris heard the door open on the other side of the counselor's hall. Neither of them saw the man who slipped in from the servants' passage, young, unremarkable, carrying nothing visible, crossing to the table where Seris had given her testimony and leaving something beneath the chair. A folded document, sealed, with the impression of a sigil that had been officially dissolved 8 months ago by royal decree. Morvaine's household seal. It was not a letter. It was addressed to the high clans of the Northern Territory, and it was already signed. Davin found the document 40 minutes after Morvaine left the hall. He brought it directly to Vaelor without opening it, which was the correct instinct, because Davin had spent 30 years in service to the Ash Dominion and understood at a cellular level that some objects required witnesses. He found Vaelor and Seris at the Eastern House, in the middle of the specific, complicated joy of a reunion between a mother and a small boy who had strong opinions about how long important things were allowed to take. Kaelin was in Seris's arms with his face against her neck and both his hands in her hair, and she was holding him with the grip of someone who has spent 9 days reminding herself that he was safe and can now finally stop reminding herself because he is here and present and real, and smells like the particular combination of wool and child and something that is simply him. Vaelor stood 3 feet away watching this with an expression he was not managing, which was new, which was its own kind of evidence of the distance he had traveled in 9 days and 3 years. Then Davin appeared in the doorway with the sealed document. Vaelor read the seal. His face did the thing it did when a military situation clarified from complicated to critical. Everything became very still, very fast. "When?" he said. "It was left in the hall during the session. The servants' passage." Davin's voice was controlled. "My lord, if that letter has already been received by the Northern Clan leadership, show me," Seris said. She had heard. She had put Kaelin down with a murmured instruction that sent him to the corner of the room where a wooden construction set had been laid out by Davin's household in an act of preparatory diplomacy, and she crossed to Vaelor and read the seal in his hand, and her face did its own version of the same clarification. "Open it," she said. Vaelor broke the seal. The letter was 3 paragraphs, precise, formal, written in the High Diplomatic Register of Interterritorial Correspondence. It informed the high clans of the Northern Territory that the Ash Dominion was in a state of internal succession dispute, that the current monarch's authority was under formal challenge, and that the clan territory's treaty obligations were therefore suspended pending resolution. It invited the Northern leadership to a meeting in the frontier territories to discuss the terms of a new compact under a governance arrangement more amenable to Northern interests. It was signed with Morvaine's household seal and dated 6 days ago, the day he arrived in Duskspire. He had sent it before the council session, before the charter motion, before any of it. The session had never been the plan. The session had been the distraction. Seris said, "He always intended to lose the vote." Vaelor looked at her. He walked in there with testimony that couldn't survive direct counter-testimony because he knew we would come back. He knew the session would fail. He needed us in that hall, focused on the charter, while this letter was already moving. She looked at the document. He wins the vote, he takes the council. He loses the vote, we spend the next weeks managing the council aftermath, while the Northern clans are already in conversation with him. She met Vaelor's eyes. Either way, he gets 6 weeks. 6 weeks for Northern clan leadership to receive a letter, deliberate, and respond was 6 weeks of treaty uncertainty, which in the Northern Territories meant 6 weeks of border patrols operating without clear authority, which meant 6 weeks of the frontier settlements, the same settlements that depended on the Dominion's governance infrastructure, existing in the specific vulnerable space of people whose protection was theoretically suspended. Hollowmere was a northern frontier settlement. Vaelor put the letter on the table. There is a specific kind of cold that settles into a person when they understand that the thing they were afraid would happen has already happened, that the move they were watching for was made before they arrived. It is not panic, Panic is what people feel when the situation is unclear and their response is unclear. This cold is something different, the absolute clarity of someone who now knows exactly what the problem is and exactly what it requires. I need to ride north tonight, Valor said. No, Seris said. He looked at her. You need to send Davin's fastest courier to every northern garrison with a counter letter bearing your seal and a direct instruction that treaty obligations are not affected by charter proceedings that have been dismissed, which is the truth and which can be verified by any council record from this afternoon. That takes 4 hours. It reaches the garrisons before any clan deliberation can conclude. She held his gaze. Then you need to be in Duskspire when Morvain finds out the letter was found, because that is when he makes his last move, and you need to be here when he does. Valor looked at her for a long moment. Yes, he said. Davin, she said, turning, draft the counter letter. I'll review it before it goes. Davin left the room at the pace of a man who understood urgency. Valor looked at Seris in the quiet that followed. You saw it faster than I did, he said. I had 3 years to understand what he was, she said. I watched his pattern of operation from the beginning. He never attacked frontally. He always built the frame before he put anyone in it. She crossed to the window. Outside, the winter light was failing toward afternoon. He's been building this frame for 3 years. This is the last piece of it. Which means there's still a piece we haven't seen. She turned. Her eyes were doing the thing they did when she was arriving at a conclusion the evidence was supporting, but she hadn't yet said aloud. Serene, she said. He waited. Where is she? Seris said. Not rhetorically, physically. Where has she been for 3 years, and where is she right now? He looked at her. Morvain brought her testimony, but he didn't bring her, she said. A document is arguable. A person is a liability. He left her outside the frame, she paused, which means she's somewhere she can still be useful. The implication was in the room before either of them said it. Valor called for a second courier. Davin's network moved through the night. The counter letter went north in 4 directions simultaneously, each copy routed through a different garrison to ensure coverage regardless of road conditions. The northern clan leadership would receive a documented record of the charter's dismissal before Morvain's invitation could be formally considered. The treaty obligations would stand. The frontier settlements would remain protected. The instrument was neutralized. The man behind it was not. Morvain did not come to them. They went to him. Valor rode to the address that Davin's intelligence placed him, a private residence in the city's administrative quarter, the kind of address that belonged to a man who had been in the capital long enough to maintain relationships outside the palace structure. The house was well maintained. A light was burning on the ground floor. The street was quiet. He knocked. Morvain opened the door himself, which meant the household staff had been dismissed, which told Valor something about the state of the calculation inside. The 2 men looked at each other across the threshold. You found it, Morvain said. Yes. Morvain stepped back from the door. Valor entered. The room was a study. Books, correspondence, the accumulated material of a political career, a fire burning low. No weapons visible, which meant nothing. A man like Morvain did not need visible weapons. They stood across the room from each other. Serene, Valor said. Morvain's expression did not change. She made her own choices. Where is she? Alive? Safe. Outside your jurisdiction in a territory that has its own extradition considerations. A pause. She's not coming back. She's done with this. Valor looked at him. The room was quiet. The fire breathed. This is the moment that the long arc of a conflict reaches its end, and the combatants find themselves standing in a room with nothing between them but the full accounting of everything that led here. Morvain had spent 3 years in exile building a return. He had built it well. He had executed it with patience and precision. He had lost. Not because he had miscalculated, he had calculated correctly at every step. He had lost because the thing he had calculated on, Seris's absence, the gap between a king and what he had thrown away, had closed. Not completely. Not cleanly, but sufficiently. The foundation of his architecture had moved and the architecture had come down. I want to tell you something, Valor said. Not as your king. Morvain waited. The infrastructure you built, Valor said. The trade routes, the provincial governance. The Northern diplomatic architecture. You were right that I dismantled it. I dismantled it because it was yours, and I was punishing everything that bore your name. He held Morvaine's gaze. That was not governance. That was a man with too much power and too much damage acting out on the empire that happened to be in reach. Morvaine's face was still.
I'm telling you this because you deserve to hear that I know it, Valor continued, not because it changes what you did, not because it settles anything, but because I've spent 3 years learning the difference between domination and governance, and I'm not willing to stand in this room and pretend I was right about everything while asking you to account for what you were wrong about. A long silence. Morvaine looked at the fire. The Eastern trade expansion took 9 years, he said. 9 years of relationship building and patient diplomacy, and deals made in cold rooms with people who didn't trust us. His voice was flat and without performance. You took it apart in 8 months. I know. And you want me to accept that acknowledgement as sufficient.
No, Valor said. I want you to accept formal exile on terms that preserve your life and what's left of your legitimate assets. And I want you to accept it because the alternative is a treason prosecution that would take everything and leave nothing, and you know it and I know it. Morvaine looked at him. The letter to the northern clans, Valor said, attempting to fracture treaty obligations during an active governance dispute. That's the document, Morvaine. That's the charge. You'd have to prove I sent it. Your seal was on it. Seals can be replicated. Your handwriting was in it. A pause. Davin has 30 years of your correspondence. The comparison takes an afternoon. The silence was different now. This is what the end of a long conflict feels like from the inside. Not triumphant, not clean, not the way the stories describe it. It feels like standing in a cold room with a fire burning low while two people who have spent years causing each other damage arrive at the accounting with clear eyes and the specific exhaustion of people who have been at this too long. There is no satisfaction in the ending of something that should never have become what it became. There is only the necessity of finishing it. Morvaine sat down. He sat with the controlled movement of someone who is choosing to sit rather than being forced to, which was the only choice left to him, and he made it with the dignity of a man who had been in power long enough to know that how you sit down matters as much as how you stand up. Terms, he said. Eastern territories. Beyond the second provincial border. You keep the personal assets that are legitimately yours. You keep your name, which is more than a treason charge would leave you. Valor's voice was even. You do not communicate with the northern clans, the provincial governors, or any current council member. You do not correspond with Serang Vale. You live quietly, and you stay there. And if I don't, then I finish the prosecution, and you lose everything, including the quiet. Valor looked at him directly. I'm not offering this because I owe you. I'm offering it because destroying you entirely serves no one except my pride. And I've been learning to govern my pride. Morvaine looked at the fire for a long time. Your wife, he said. She's the one who saw the letter's purpose. Yes. She's the one who sent the counter letters. Yes. Something moved in Morvaine's face. Not admiration exactly, the specific quality of a man revising an assessment he had held for too long. I calculated her wrong, he said. Most people do, Valor said. At first. Morvaine was quiet. I accept the terms, he said. He left Duskspire 4 days later. Quietly, before first light, without ceremony, with a packed wagon and a small household and the specific posture of a man who had decided that the terms he had were the terms he had and was going to inhabit them with whatever remained of his dignity. Valor watched him go from the outer wall, not with satisfaction, with the sober recognition of someone who understood that the end of a conflict is not a victory. It is simply the end. And what comes after is the longer, harder work of building something in the space where the fighting was. The work began immediately. It always does. The Eastern trade architecture that Morvaine had built over 9 years and Valor had dismantled in 8 months could not be reconstructed in weeks. But it could be begun. Seris identified 3 provincial governors who had maintained relationships with the northern territories independently of Morvaine's network. Smaller relationships, quieter ones, but real. And she sat with them in the working study on the second floor with the healer's ledgers and the provincial correspondence, and she rebuilt the diplomatic framework conversation by conversation,
relationship by relationship, with the same methodical attention she brought to long-term patient care. She did not ask Vialor's permission for any of it. He did not offer it. He had his own work. The garrison commanders needed the counter letters formalized into official doctrine. The council needed a framework that prevented another charter maneuver. Not impossible, but requiring structural reform that took time and good faith engagement with members who had spent the past 6 days hedging their positions. Wren, surprisingly, became the most useful ally in this, not from personal conviction, but from the practical recognition that a governance structure vulnerable to the instrument Morvain had used was a governance structure that put everyone at risk. Kalen learned the palace. He approached it the way he approached everything, with systematic curiosity and a complete absence of intimidation. The kitchen staff found him in their domain on the third morning, examining the spice collection with intense focus, and responded to him with the same quality of attention the household had always given Seris. Not deference, but genuine engagement, the particular warmth of people who had been waiting a long time for something real to return to the place. He made a friend of the head cook within 4 days, which was faster than most adults had managed. He asked about the wolves on the banners. Seris told him. She sat with him in the study on a winter evening with a fire burning and the pressed flower frame from her frontier province on the shelf above the books. And she explained, in the direct, honest language she always used, what the Ash Dominion was and what it meant and what he was in relation to it. She explained it without ceremony and without the performance of significance, the same way she explained anything, as information he deserved to have because he was the person it affected most. He listened. He thought about it for a while. "It's a lot of wolves," he said finally. "It is," she said. "Do I have to like wolves?" "No, but you'll need to understand them." He nodded. This seemed satisfactory. "Can I keep the schist?" "You can always keep the schist." She told Vialor about this conversation later, standing in the doorway of the study after Kalen was asleep. She told it without particular color, just the clean recounting of what was said, and he listened with the quality of attention he had been bringing to everything she said since Hollowmere. Not managed listening, not the listening of a man performing engagement, but the real kind. The kind that means the other person is the most important thing in the room. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He asked if he had to like wolves, Vialor said. "Yes. He's 3. Almost. He told me yesterday," Vialor said, "that the North Garden has no schist, which he considers a significant oversight." Something happened in Seris's face. Not a full smile. The precursor of one. The specific quality of expression that means something is funny and something is also not funny, and both are true at the same time. "We should do something about that," she said. "I was thinking the same." The fire in the study was steady. Outside, the mountain held its winter. The black towers rose against the dark sky in the same configuration they had risen for 100 years, indifferent to everything that happened inside them, which was the correct posture for architecture. Architecture should not have opinions. The people inside it should. There were nights, in the weeks that followed, when the distance between them was still visible. Not hostile, not performed, just real. The natural distance of 2 people who had been through a specific kind of damage and were rebuilding in the same house without pretending the damage had not occurred. There were evenings when Seris sat in her study long after Vialor expected her, and he did not knock because she did not need him to knock. There were mornings when he was in the war chamber before first light with the correspondence, and she came in not because he needed her, but because she was interested in what was happening, and this was her empire too. And they worked side by side in the gray morning light, without a great deal of words, because they had never needed words when they were both reading the same material. They were finding, in the ordinary machinery of days, what they could not have found in a single conversation. One evening, 3 weeks after their return, Vialor put down a trade correspondence and looked at Seris across the study table and said, without preamble, "I need to tell you something." She looked up from the provincial ledger. "I drafted the succession decree for Kalen 8 months ago," he said. "I told you that. I told you I did it because it was right regardless of your decision." He held her gaze. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. She waited. "I drafted it because he was real to me, before I ever met him, before I ever saw him. He was real and he was mine, and the idea that the world might proceed as though he wasn't." He stopped. His jaw worked briefly. I couldn't manage the Empire correctly if I couldn't acknowledge the most important fact about my own life. He was that fact, even in his absence. He paused. And you were the other. The room was quiet. That's the thing I couldn't do before, he said. I couldn't hold that kind of fact without immediately trying to control it. I couldn't let something matter that much without looking for the mechanism to protect myself from it mattering. He looked at her with the specific directness of someone who has stripped away every instrument of self-protection and is speaking from the exposed place underneath. I don't know how to do what comes next. I don't have a framework for it.
But I know I want to be in the same room with you working on it. That is the whole truth. Seris looked at him for a long time. The fire between them was steady, not dramatic, not the wildfire of the early years when everything was urgent and charged and moving at the speed of two people discovering each other in a palace full of dangers. This was something different, something that had been tested at temperature and had not broken, something that knew its own history and was choosing to continue anyway. This is what people do not tell you about the kinds of love that survive catastrophe. They do not come out of it soft. They come out of it with an entirely accurate understanding of what they almost lost, which means they come out of it with clear eyes and no remaining illusions. And that clarity is not comfortable, but it is real. And real is worth more than comfortable when you are building something that has to last. I know, she said. You know. I know you don't have a framework. She set down the ledger. Neither do I. I had a framework for leaving. I had a framework for surviving. I had a framework for coming back. She met his eyes. I don't have a framework for what this is. What is it? He said. She thought about it. Something that knows where the cracks are, she said, and is choosing to stand in it anyway. He held her gaze. Yes, he said, that. They were quiet together for a while. Outside, somewhere in the palace's north wing, Kalen made a sound in his sleep, a brief, emphatic sound, likely related to whatever he was building in his dreams, which, based on the waking evidence, involved significant architectural ambition. Seris heard it. Her attention shifted for a moment in the direction of his room. Came back. He's fine, Valor said. I know. A pause. I always know. This is what it means to be a parent, which is a thing neither of them had a framework for before it happened, and neither of them will ever stop learning. The specific constant awareness of another person's existence, the way their presence rewrites the architecture of everything else around it without asking permission. Kalen had rewritten them both. He had rewritten them separately, in different houses and different conditions, and now he was rewriting them again in the same house. And the rewrite was different from either of the previous versions and would probably keep changing for as long as any of them were alive. That was what Valor had said in Hollowmere, standing in a yard with an axe and a task that had no strategic value and everything human value. I would like to learn. He had said it about towers. He had meant it about everything else. Learning is the only honest response to a life that insists on being more complicated than your frameworks can contain. The second vow ceremony happened on a morning in late winter when the mountain had the first suggestion of thaw in it. Not spring yet, not warm, but the air carrying the specific quality of something that had been frozen for a long time beginning to remember another state. It was small. Seris had required this, and Vialor had agreed to it, not because she required it, but because he understood why. There was nothing left to perform. There was nobody left to impress. The Empire knew they were back. The council had recorded the testimony. The succession decree had been formally sanctioned. Morvain was in the Eastern Territories living quietly, as agreed, because he was a man who honored terms when the terms were the only favorable option available. The ceremony needed no audience. Davin was there. Tiva, who had ridden south because Seris had asked her, and because Teva was the kind of person who showed up. Kala, for the same reason. A handful of people from the palace household who had been there long enough that their presence was not political but personal. Kalen stood between his parents with his piece of schist in his coat pocket, and the expression of someone who had been told this was important and was taking that assessment seriously. Vialor spoke first, not a prepared speech. He had tried to prepare one and had abandoned it 3 times because every version felt like a managed document, and what he owed her was not a managed document. I know what this cost you, he said. I know what the corridor cost you, and the winter road, and the 3 years in Hollowmere, and coming back here on 20 days' notice to testify for a man who gave you every reason to stay gone. His voice was even, not performed emotion, something quieter and more durable. I'm not going to ask forgiveness because forgiveness isn't mine to ask for on a timeline of my choosing. What I'm going to do is spend every day I have left making sure that the life you chose to rebuild is worth what it cost you to come back to it. He looked at her with those eyes that had learned slowly and at considerable expense to hold what they saw without managing it. That is a dangerous promise for a man who used to be very careful about promises.
Yes, Seris said. It is. I'm familiar with danger. I know. She looked at him. So am I. She took a breath. I came back because of what is right, she said. I told you that in Hollowmere. That's still true. But it's not the whole truth. The whole truth is... She paused. Not because she didn't know the words, because she was choosing them with the same care she brought to everything that mattered. The whole truth is that I spent 3 years building a life that proved I didn't need this. Didn't need the palace or the crown or the bond or you. Proved it thoroughly, lived it completely. And then you showed up at my door without your banners and sat on the floor with our son and learned what schist was called, and I... Another pause. I understood that not needing something and not wanting it are different things, and I have been a scientist about my own life for long enough. Teva made a sound that was not a cough. Kaelin looked at both of them. Are you done? He asked. Seris looked down at him. Almost, she said. Good. I'm cold. Davin made a sound that was definitely not a laugh. The ceremony concluded with the particular informal efficiency of something done in the open air on a winter morning by people who had more important things to do than stand still. The vow sigil, new, commissioned in the weeks before, obsidian set in the same silver wire but with a different configuration, because she had told the craftsman she didn't want the same thing back. She wanted something that acknowledged a different chapter, went back around her throat. She clasped it herself. Then Kaelin tugged on Valor's sleeve. Can we go inside now, he said. I want to show you where I think the North Garden should have schist. Valor looked at his son. He had been looking at him for weeks now with a quality of attention that was unlike any attention he had applied to anything in his years of governance. Not strategic, not assessing, not managed. Simply present. The specific presence of someone who knows they are in the presence of something irreplaceable and has stopped pretending they are too composed to notice. He took Kaelin's hand. Show me, he said. They walked inside. Seris stood for a moment in the winter air outside the palace walls, beneath the black towers and the obsidian wolves and the cold, clear sky, and she breathed. Once. Not the breathing of a woman managing a crisis, the breathing of a woman standing in a place she chose, beside people she chose, inside a life that had been tested at every possible temperature and had not broken. She had not come back because the bond demanded it. She had not come back because power required it. She had come back because she was Seris, and she had rebuilt herself from nothing in a frontier settlement in 3 years' worth of cold mornings. And what she had discovered in the rebuilding was that she was large enough to contain both the woman who had walked away and the woman who chose to return, and that the choice itself, made with clear eyes and accurate information and no illusions about what it cost, was the thing that made it real. Love handed freely by fate is beautiful. Love rebuilt by choice, through damage and distance, and the specific hard work of two people who know exactly where the cracks are and have decided to stand in it anyway. That is something else. That is not a story that ends. That is the kind that simply continues, day by day, in the ordinary and extraordinary work of being present to the life you have chosen. The wind came off the mountain. The torches in the black marble corridors burned steady. Inside, somewhere in the north wing, a small voice was explaining, with great conviction and considerable detail, exactly where the schist should go. The empire held. The family held. And in the study on the second floor, a pressed flower frame from a frontier province that had been there before any of this began remained on the shelf above the books, which was exactly where it belonged and exactly where it would stay.